All right, hello, and welcome back to Real Seeker, Shroud fans. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker, and we are continuing on with the Shroud Wars with a brand new Shroud Skeptic, Michael J. Alter, who's a Jewish independent researcher who's very critical of Dr. Gary Habermas's work on the resurrection. And I had an opportunity, thanks to a couple of funny atheists and skeptics online, Apologia and the Rabid Atheist, to reach out to Michael Alter and talk to him a little bit about his scholarship. And he was very kind and very sharing with a bunch of his sources. And during our back and forth, he mentioned that he's actually written a chapter on the Shroud of Turin, and he noticed that was an area of specialization on my front. So I wanted to provide a response to his Shroud chapter. I invited Michael on. He preferred not to come on and said, trust me to make a PowerPoint presentation laying out his arguments and giving a fair assessment. So, first of all, who is Michael Alter? He's a Jewish independent researcher. He doesn't have a PhD, but he has specialized in studying the English literature on Jesus' resurrection for the past 500 years. And he's been known for critiquing Gary Habermas's scholarly consensus criterion for his minimal facts approach. And he has provided his research in a 119-page journal paper. So he's got a peer-reviewed paper found at this website. He also has a critical review of Lydia McGrew's Undesigned Coincidences argument on the Whip and Stock book site. And you can see him in a video on the History Valley podcast talking about his research for the past couple decades, I would say, or 13 years, I think he says, looking at all of the English books on the resurrection from 1500 to the present. And in one of his books, he has this chapter on the Shroud of Turin in his book entitled The Resurrection and Its Apologetics, Jesus' Death and Burial. And it's found on this website where you, apparently for the month of November, you can get it half off. So here's his book on the Whip and Stock Publishers website. I'll include the link in the YouTube video description for you guys. And here's Michael Alter himself on the History Valley podcast on the show entitled The Fabricated Resurrection, The Minimal Facts Debunked with Michael Alter. And as I said, it's now half off through the AAR, or Society for Biblical Literature conference sale underway, which includes his book, The Thematic Axis-Oriented Bibliography of Jesus' Resurrection. Half off until November 30th, and Gary Habermas actually read this and endorsed this book, even though it's critical of his research. Use the code CONFSHIP at checkout, and the shipping is fee-free if you select Media Mail. But that's not why we're here today. I'm specifically interested in his chapter on the Shroud of Turin. So again, that is contained in his book, The Resurrection and Its Apologetics, Jesus' Death and Burial. And in this chapter, he appeals to 13 main topics related to the historical authenticity or inauthenticity of the Shroud of Turin, meaning proving that it is or is not the actual burial cloth of the historical Jesus Christ that covered him in the tomb in 30 AD. Now, his book doesn't get much into the scientific evidence. It does deal with it in certain sections, but it's sort of tangential. I think I separate Shroud scholarship into two fields, the historical authenticity question and the miraculous authenticity question, because I could care less whether that thing is medieval or not. That's irrelevant. For me, the scientific evidence absolutely proves that it is a miraculous image for the purpose of authenticating Jesus' resurrection in 30 AD. And it doesn't matter if it's medieval or not on that front. However, Michael Alter, as most people, he is assuming the historical authenticity is a relevant factor, and therefore he's trying to assess that question mainly in his chapter. In the end, he concludes that the Shroud is inauthentic and a medieval fraud, and I do find that he quotes very heavily from skeptics like Colin Barry and mostly Hugh Ferry. I think Hugh Ferry was profoundly influential on Michael Alter's end conclusions and that sort of thing, and especially his papers on the academia.edu, where he quotes from the Medieval Shroud Part 2 paper quite a bit from Hugh Ferry. But let's get into it. So in his Shroud chapter, he covers 13 sections or 13 topics. So firstly, the 1988 carbon-14 dating. Second, the D'Arcis Memorandum. Thirdly, the Hungarian Pray Codex or Pray manuscript. 4, the ancient fabric evidence. 5, the evidence from the dirt particles. 6, blood stains. 7, flowers and pollen. 8, anatomy. 9, artistic evidence. 10, pilot coins over the eyes. 11, writing on the cloth. And 12, problematic issues. And finally, 13, what the New Catholic Encyclopedia says. So in this series, we're going to cover all of these. It's probably going to be done in multiple parts. For this one, I'm going to cover just the first 3 topics. I think the first 3 topics are what he covers in the most detail in his Shroud chapter and provides the most balance. I do like Michael Alter provided both sides, or at least lists the arguments of both sides, and very clearly listed in number format, so easy to identify and keep track of what's going on. So yeah, that said, let's get into the first one, the 1988 carbon-14 dating. Now, as a Shroud skeptic, Alter claims the following, quote unquote, the results of radiocarbon measurements at Arizona, Oxford, and Zurich yield a calibrated calendar age range with at least 95% confidence for the linen of the Shroud being 1260 to 1390 AD. He says these results therefore provide conclusive evidence that the linen of the Shroud of Turin is medieval. Now, here Alter is aware that the pro-Shroud side does have defeaters for this claim. However, I think the way he words it, he does clearly betray his bias a little bit here, where he says it's conclusive and that sort of thing, and just takes it at face value, so to speak. Because when he's presenting the other side of the issue, he uses little things, right? So, for example, he says, quote unquote, since the 1988 publication in Nature, devout religious believers, sometimes called authenticists or shroudies, in the Shroud have disputed the carbon dating result. Well, this is his bias coming out, because it's not just devout religious believers. We might as well just say it's devout religious atheists and skeptics, non-Christians who ever doubt the Shroud of Turin. But in point of fact, we have devout religious Christian believers that doubt the carbon dating. We have atheists, we have agnostics, we have Muslims, we have Jews, non-religious Jews, just like Michael Alter. We don't just have one worldview bias that's dictating this. In fact, we even have fellow carbon-14 scientists, and even some of the scientists who dated the Shroud itself, or worked for the labs, such as Christopher Ramsey at Oxford Radiocarbon Labs, who all doubt the 1989 journal Nature conclusion here, and have refuted it, and or provided serious doubts about it. So this is just not true, and I think it reveals his bias. He thinks it's only biased Christians or shroudy, quote-unquote shroudies, who would have a problem or dispute the carbon dating results. That's just not true. And for those of my fans, I've interviewed some of these atheists and agnostics who said this. So we have the absolute proof. This is not a religious belief at all, if you doubt this. In fact, it goes back to the journal Nature itself, because in the same 1989 paper, they published another paper by the Harvard carbon-14 scientist, Dr. Thomas Phillips, who published that neutron irradiation could easily make the Shroud a 30 AD cloth and explain the erroneous medieval dates obtained, much to the chagrin of many biased atheists and agnostic carbon-14 scientists who didn't like hearing this and demanded the paper be taken out, but it wasn't, because the science was good. Michael Alter, in terms of his bias, he also labels the defeaters presented against the carbon-14 in a slightly derogatory way, right? He labels them as, quote-unquote, excuses, which, again, sort of betrays his bias a little bit. So that's just my honest opinion. I like that Michael Alter is fair and balanced in that he is to the best in terms of what he presents. I think he presents the pro shroud side accurately in terms of the counters we've offered. But there's a clear slant against those defeaters that are presented on the pro shroud side by Michael Alter. You can see that what his conclusion is, and it is slightly being pushed, especially in this section on the carbon 14. So yeah, that's just my take in general. So what are these things? So Alter lists about 6 quote-unquote excuses that the pro shroud side uses to invalidate the carbon 14 dating. So number 1, we didn't follow the agreed upon testing protocols. Secondly, radiocarbon dates are often wrong in general. 3, contamination of the samples. 4, the parts of the shroud that were tested were all taken from a peripheral area that nuns repaired in the 16th century and were not representative of the whole cloth. 5, the material was deliberately switched and it did not come from the shroud. 6, the laboratories deliberately falsified the results. Other investigators dispute this allegation. Okay, so falsification, right? Stephen Jones and Bruno. Now, interesting, I just say interestingly here as a general comment. This is on page 117 of his book, The Resurrection and Its Apologetics. He doesn't mention John Jackson's carbon monoxide extraordinary form of contamination hypothesis. This was actually tested scientifically by Dr. Christopher Ramsay, carbon-14 scientist, and as far as I know, he's a godless atheist. He's not a biased Christian, and he works for Oxford Labs, one of the labs that actually dated the Shroud of Turin in 1988. And I've quoted Christopher Ramsay before as saying, we have absolutely not proven the shroud is medieval. The carbon-14 dating contradicts all the other credible evidence that we have, and therefore a responsible scientist cannot believe one way or the other. We need further testing to resolve this contradiction. And Christopher Ramsay admits that he's biased. He believes the shroud is medieval, but he admits the data can't be used to prove that with any degree of conclusivity or absoluteness at all. We need further testing, according to PhD Dr. Christopher Ramsay, the head of Oxford Radiocarbon Labs, back in 2008. And finally, the most important, I do find it interesting, Alter misses the most important defeater, the one mentioned by Thomas Phillips, and later expounded upon by nuclear engineer and my personal friend Bob Rucker, who's been on the show various times. But it's the statistical anomalies that have been absolutely mathematically proven and were known about back in 1989 by the journal Nature. But the scientists back then fudged the data. They lied to the public. They purposefully published a fraud. And it's been now proven after Tristan Casabianca sued the British Museum under the Freedom of Information Act and forced them legally to publish the raw data, that the fudging of the data was actually proven and published in the Oxford University peer-reviewed journal Archaeometry. The shroud data displays a systematic bias, which means they don't have a 95% degree of certainty, and therefore the results are garbage. You cannot trust them statistically at all. But I'll get into more details on number 8 in a little bit. Let's go back. So of the 6 excuses, Michael Alter chooses 3 of them to assess and evaluate. Okay, so excuse number 1, he looks at the changes in the protocols, right? So Alter lists 7 specific changes in the agreed upon protocol. Obviously, we would know, fans of my show will know there are millions of more changes in the protocol. There's so many political shenanigans going on behind the scenes with the carbon-14 scientists like Harry Gove and Michael Tite and stuff like that. And Joe Marino does an excellent job exposing the bias and corruption on that front in his massive book on the carbon-14 fiasco. So check out Joe Marino's excellent book, published in 2020, I believe it was. And he was on my show advertising his book and giving his detailed presentation there. Anyways, Alter lists the 7 changes as follows. 1, the involvement of 7 laboratories has been reduced to 3. This eliminates the possibility of detecting a mistake made in the measurement by one or more of the 3 labs. And he notes, Alter notes that Tite knows such mistakes are not unusual. So I think this is a key one I want to focus on. 2, the use of both decay counting and accelerator mass spectrometry has been changed to AMS labs only. The 2 methods are distinct and independent. So if you just remember, at the time, there were 3 brand new. The other one was gas, liquid scintillation or gas decay counting, I think it was. So there was 3 new techniques, including AMS at the time, and they were competing with each other back in the 1980s. So they're saying having only one technique is not sufficient. They originally planned on having at least 2 different methods. 3, the amount of cloth each AMS laboratory receives has been increased by almost a factor of 2. With this much material, several more laboratories could have been included. 4, representatives of the 3 labs will not be permitted to observe the sample removal from the shroud. 5, here's another key one. The shroud and control samples will not be unraveled, and thus, despite Tite's comments to the contrary, the shroud sample will be much more easily identifiable. So yeah, he gives quotes here that it was not blind testing. And this is a crucial thing because so many shroud skeptics just sort of, if I'm truth be told, mindlessly reject the more credible dating, physical and scientific dating things, proving the shrouds from the 1st century by people like Giulio Fonte or Dr. Liberato De Caro, such as the wax dating that was published in the peer-reviewed journal, in a peer-reviewed science journal back in 2022. Both Giulio Fonte and Liberato are my friends. I've known them and I've done shows detailing in specific detail their work on that front. But Giulio Fonte also had other dating techniques, physical tensile strength, the FTIR, Raman spectroscopy dating, all proving the shroud is from the 1st century. But one of the criticisms with these datings, it wasn't a blind testing, so it doesn't count. But yet the fundy-laid shroud skeptics, at least, don't understand. But so is the carbon-14. That wasn't blind either, so we can just dismiss that. And of course, the skeptics go, no, that's an exception to the rule. We have to believe that because that tells me what we want to hear, right? No. You have to be. So I really appreciate that Michael Alter is being fair and admitting, look, this was not a blind test. Number 6, the scientific body connected with the Roman Catholic Church, which has a high reputation in the world of science, the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, has unaccountably been excluded from official participation. And I would like to add to that, Harry Gov made it his business out of atheistic bias to remove STIRP from participating, even though they were the ones that committed the only scientific series of investigation and tests on the shroud in person in 1978. And it was their idea to do about 26 more further scientific in-person tests, including carbon-14 dating. The carbon-14 scientists like Harry Gov and Michael Tite and all the rest wouldn't have been involved at all if it wasn't for STIRP. But yet, Harry Gov, like a snake, turned back on them and eliminated them and all the other tests. Why? Because he wanted the fame for himself. He wanted all the attention, all the media on his invention of AMS carbon-14 dating, which desperately needed public relations and some positive PR to gain prominence in the field. So that's another thing that was very despicable on their part. 7, the acknowledged textile expert selected at the Turin workshop to remove the shroud sample has been replaced by some unnamed person. So these are the 7 changes, and some of them I would say, look, these in and of themselves don't invalidate the tests. However, some of them do. I think the blind testing does, because then you can't rule out fraud and stuff like that. Also, the 7 labs down to 3, I highlighted this because I think it's very important that Michael Alter misses something that's extremely important here. Not just 7 labs down to 3, but changing of the 3 sample locations down to one single sample location. And that does invalidate the carbon-14 dating results. Now, to his credit, Michael Alter does quote from Harry Gov as saying, quote unquote, all these unnecessary and unexplained changes unilaterally dictated by the Archbishop of Turin will produce an age for the Turin Shroud which will be vastly less credible than that which could have been obtained if the original Turin workshop protocol had been followed. The shroud should be performed blind, seemed to the author to be lacking in merit for disbelieving the result. So even Harry Gov himself, he hated Shroudies. He hated the Shroudie, wanted to disprove it. That was his bias as a worldview atheist, proven in his own letters before the dating. And here he is saying that the change in protocol should substantially make the results less credible. And I go on because Alter neglects to mention the most important change in the protocol here, that the 3 sample locations were reduced to 1. And this means we can't mitigate sufficiently against contamination problems because of an insufficient sample size. And I quote Harry Gov himself as saying this: the new procedure suggested by the Cardinal of Torino, 7 labs down to 3 and 3 samples to locations to 1, is bound to produce a dating result that will be questioned in strictly scientific terms by many scientists around the world, who will be very skeptical of the arbitrarily small statistical basis for our testing. The use of a single sample is ill-advised, as it will not generate a reliable date, but will rather give rise to world controversy. We suggest that it would be better not to date the shroud at all. It goes on further. The piece that was removed from the shroud was divided among the 3 labs and came from one specific spot. If there was some reason why the carbon-14 content in that piece were contaminated, it's inaccurate. All of the labs used the same cleaning technique, which did not account for various embedded or chemically bounded or enhanced forms of contamination. And if there is some kind of contaminant not taken care of, then it would give the same answer to all 3 labs, and all 3 would be wrong. A boom. I think this utterly destroys the Shroud skeptics' claim that the shroud is provably or probably medieval on the basis of the carbon-14. Far from being conclusive, even your own guy, Harry Gov, admits it proves bupkis because they only dated 1 sample. It is irrelevant. And what's funny here is he mentions that all 3 labs used the same cleaning technique. Well, as we'll discover now, scientifically proven fact that no one can deny in the 6 peer-reviewed science journals, as I'll show you, all proving that, well, actually, the results prove that it can't be medieval. It doesn't date between 1260 to 1390 with a 95% degree of confidence. And as we'll see, how do Shroud skeptics in the modern world, post-2017, how do they deal with this? They just, on an ad hoc or a post hoc rationalization, say, well, maybe one of the labs had a different cleaning procedure. That's what Hugh Ferry says, for example. It's all speculation, no proof, but it actually contradicts what Dr. Harry Gov, someone intimately involved in the actual carbon-14 dating of the shroud, the guy who invented the carbon-14 technology used to date the shroud, and who was associated with Michael Tite and everybody else through the whole process. And yet he says, well, all the labs use the same cleaning technique. So is Gov lying? Or is maybe the Shroud skeptic like Hugh Ferry lying some 30 to 40 years after the fact, desperate to account for the data showing that the carbon-14 scientists fudged the raw data that they got back in 1989, and he's trying to desperately come up with some excuse. I think excuse fits more on the Shroud skeptic side here. rather than on the other side. Now, oddly, I would say this: Alter provides no counters to these quotes, nor the fact of the changes in the protocol having occurred. He just lists them. So I'm assuming he accepts, yeah, these are all true. These 7 changes happen. And for that reason, I'm unsure why Alter would obviously disagree with this. Why is he a Shroud skeptic on the basis of the carbon 14? How does it warrant giving conclusive proof when just the changes in the protocol alone and the quotes from Dr. Harry Gove, a carbon 14 scientist, which neither I, a philosopher, or Michael Alter, as an independent researcher in the historical evidence for the resurrection, we don't have expertise, but Harry Gove does, and he says the results are bunk. Don't believe it. You can't believe in the results because of the changed procedure, the fact that they only dated a single sample. So this, to say that, just dismiss this and say, well, this is just an excuse on the pro-Shroud side, I just think this is a blatant example of disconfirmation bias on the part of Michael Alter, and therefore it's irrational. It's fallacious reasoning for him to continue to hold to the carbon 14 just on the basis of the protocol changes argument alone, type thing. All right, but let's move on. The next excuse he covers is, generally speaking, carbon 14 dating is bunk. Now, I will admit this: Alter rightfully mentions some of the problematic studies showing the resultant errors in AMS carbon 14 dating, as well as carbon 14 dating in general. And especially that was happening back in the 1980s. So he is aware of some of these studies through Hugh Ferry again. And he even cites a peer-reviewed study showing that initially 23 out of 38 labs failed to meet 3 essential criteria for adequate performance. This is on page 118 in his chapter, in his book, including this Shroud chapter. Now, this should be troubling, right? This should make you go, well, what is going on with these carbon 14 results? And I've quoted this study myself, as has Hugh Ferry, and I've quoted them from New Scientist magazine and that sort of thing, as well as posting up the peer-reviewed papers themselves. Now, with respect to the AMS carbon 14 labs in particular, even Hugh Ferry on his blog, Absence of Evidence, Make It Up, this is a blog of Hugh critiquing me, and because I cited various studies, about 3 or 4 studies, arguing that AMS carbon 14 was garbage and rubbish at carbon 14 dating textiles in the late 1980s. It's a more nuanced claim. It's not denouncing carbon 14 in general. It's saying, yeah, but there was problems with carbon 14, AMS carbon 14 dating textiles in the late 1980s. And Hugh is taking me to task in this blog, but even here he has to admit, look, 2 of the 5 AMS labs, a whopping huge 40% of the AMS lab, carbon 14 labs tested, failed the systematic bias criterion. That is horrible in scientific terms, especially when you think of it. When they dated the Shroud, they only had 3 labs, AMS carbon 14 labs, dating the Shroud. Well, if there were 2 out of the 5 that flunked, how many of the 3? Maybe all 3 out of the 3 could have easily failed. You needed a better amount of labs to cover that, at least 7 or more, to help mitigate against this problem where the labs failed the systematic bias criterion. And this criterion in particular plays a crucial role as we come to those statistical problems, right? That was the issue, systematic bias. In 1989, the carbon 14 dating scientists fudged the data. They lied to the people. They knew there was this statistical anomalies and problems, but they lied to the people and said, oh, don't worry about it. It's not systematic bias. It's a random measuring error. We're just going to assume it's that. Now it's been absolutely proven, 98.6% probability, systematic bias accounts for the results that they got in 1988 and 1989 with the carbon 14 dating of the Shroud of Turin. very interesting that even Hugh Ferry, the ultimate Shroud skeptic, and Michael Alter's, sort of role model, the one he sort of is inspired. He gets a lot of his conclusions and assessments from Hugh Ferry's work and from his blogs and his papers and that sort of thing. Even Hugh saying, yep, the AMS labs sucked. The best he could say is, yeah, but other carbon-14 techniques sucked even worse. I don't care. That AMS is horrible. 40% failure rate, meaning only a 60% success rate with just 5 labs being tested. That is horrible. And it's so telling. They failed out of all the criteria, the internal and external. It was the third one, the systematic bias criterion, they flunked. Precisely the same criterion that caused the problems in 1989 with dating the Shroud. Very interesting. Now, this in turn caused the leader of the study, Dr. Murdoch Baxter, the director of the Scottish University's Research and Reactor Centre at East Kilbride, to conclude that the errors found in this study go well beyond uncertainties related to measurement errors, as the carbon-14 scientists falsely assumed in 1989, and now proven statistically when they dated the Shroud. Dr. Baxter exclaimed, quote unquote, "It is now clear that other unaccounted for sources of error occur during the processing and analyzing of the samples. The AMS labs in particular were way out, even when dating samples as little as 200 years old. They sucked." And this is Dr. Murdoch Baxter, the guy who wrote the peer-reviewed paper, 3 peer-reviewed papers detailing this incredible study of 38 carbon-14 labs from around the world, showing, man, carbon-14 sucks. It doesn't work in the same way, especially with the AMS labs. Those things were horrible, according to Dr. Murdoch Baxter. Now, beyond this, Alter cites the conclusion of Hugh Ferry, as well as the conclusion in a journal article in the Radiocarbon Journal, saying that the sample taken was probably taken from the Shroud cloth proper, so it's not an invisible reweave or patch. That's all that he covers from the invisible reweave. He doesn't address anything else, any of the evidence for or against it, apart from saying, well, in the Radiocarbon Journal, these carbon-14 scientists just dismissed that as a possibility. Now, okay, so yeah, I look, assertions are easy, but you've got to prove it on the basis of the evidence. I don't believe in the invisible reweave myself. I think the evidence disproves that very strongly. In particular, there are 3 pieces of evidence I quote, kind of thing. But the point is, there's positive evidence. There is evidence on both sides, and you have to grapple with that and take that seriously. You can't just dismiss it because, hey, Hugh Ferry and a bunch of carbon-14 scientists just said, oh yeah, it's part of the cloth proper. Additionally, they say that the 3 labs agreeing is enough to dismiss random measurement error on the lab's part. Well, once again, yes, that's true. Random measurement error is not the issue. Systematic bias is now the statistically proven issue. Something is affecting the results of that carbon-14 dating in a systematic or linear way. Essentially 36 years per centimeter. There's a gradient or slope to the 12 subsamples that were carbon-14 dated in 1989. Again, more details on that later. Okay, excuse number 3, conspiracy or fraud. Now, on these, Alter lists 2 theories and simply cites Hugh Ferry to refute them, saying, again, Ferry refutes this allegation by saying, finally, all else having been discredited, there are the deliberate fakery. As with most such conspiracy theories, a few details which in isolation appear corroborative are clearly refuted when seen in their wider context. This is a quote from Alter on page 121 in his chapter, and he gives the examples. So there's Bruno Bonnet. Imard basically says that Michael Tite breached the protocol and went off camera, another breach in the protocols, and they went to a secret back room. This is scientifically proven fact. Everybody admits this, even Michael Tite, that he went into a secret room And Bruno says, well, that's where they switched and swapped out samples. No wonder they carbon dated a medieval thing. They purposefully swapped out the Shroud sample and put in a medieval sample. So it's a fraud, it's a fake, it's a phony. And that's why we got the fake results that we did with them, showing it with a medieval carbon 14 date. There's also Stephen Jones, who has a less credible theory about Russians hacking the system and that sort of thing. But just focusing on this swapped samples, Alter says this is clearly refuted by Hugh, but when it's seen in their wider context, what does that mean? There is no explanation or details as to what these refutations are or what the wider context is. And no, I can attest, knowing Hugh Ferry personally, I can attest that he has admitted he has no refutations or either on his end. All he has is mockery and saying, well, this is a conspiracy theory, and conspiracy theories are lunatics. You might as well say that aliens believed it. But this is just bias. I'm sorry. Sometimes conspiracies are true. Look, conspiracy theories happen all the time. There's a conspiracy that Santa Claus exists. Every single adult in the world practically participates in this, or that the Easter Bunny or Tooth Fairy. Every adult, including experts in their field, people working at NORAD, they claim to witness Santa on his sleigh flying through the air. They tell kids, hey, we're tracking Santa Claus. That's a conspiracy. Conspiracies happen. We have to remember that, right? We can't just keep dismissing. Look at the freaking COVID thing. Fauci was a fraud. That guy lied to the people. The guy was a fake phony. That was a literal conspiracy theory during the COVID vaccinations and masks and stuff like that. That was conspiracy. So sometimes conspiracies happen, and we have to stop this ad hominem attitude towards it. This is not a refutation of it. And I want to know what reasons. I have reasons. I don't believe this, and I'll tell in a moment. But Michael Alter, for you, and also for Hugh Ferry or any Shroud skeptic, because I always ask them. I asked Hugh, and I also asked another Mike from Evil Christianity, and they laugh at the samples being swapped out. I'm like, okay, prove it. Prove that they weren't swapped out. The facts are Michael Tite went into a back room with a couple of others off camera, which was a breach of the agreed upon protocols. The samples were never to be off camera, but they went into a little back room, a secret back room hidden from the cameras, and then came out with the samples afterwards. How do you know they didn't switch out the samples? Prove it. Don't just go, they would never do that. No, I don't believe you. Prove it. What proof do you have they didn't switch out the samples? Now, here's my reason why I say it's improbable. It comes from the criterion of enemy attestation. Pro-Shroud historian Ian Wilson knew personally Michael Tite and vouched for him and his character to the degree that he would not commit outright fraud. So for me, this is the wider context. This is the fact that goes, yeah, I think it's improbable. It's still possible, even plausible, but I would say it's given Ian Wilson, it's very improbable that Michael Tite switched out the samples and there was some kind of fraud on that level kind of thing, right? So that's my reason personally. I actually have a reason grounded in rational criteria for truth or authenticity, such as the criterion of enemy attestation. This is a criterion used in modern court systems today, right? It's one of the exceptions when you can use hearsay evidence, for example, in a modern court, is if it's from an enemy or it's embarrassing, right? It's something that goes against what you want to hear. So that's my reason. But before I gave you that, what was yours? What was this wider context? I wish more details were done here, because every time I've probed a Shroud skeptic, they've got nothing. They've just got, haha, that's a conspiracy theory, and you must be a lunatic if you believe a conspiracy theory. Haha, that's all the skeptics have got. There's nothing rational as to why they dismiss this type of fraud hypothesis. So yeah, that's the only thing I wanted to say on that. So I'm on Alter's side. I think it's improbable. I think Hugh is correct. I just wish, why don't you give the details? Give what rational basis do you have for dismissing this or claiming this is an improbable hypothesis to be true. And if all you got is, well, if that's true, then I can't believe, I interviewed Mike from Evil Christianity. He's just saying, well, I just have to trust them because otherwise, I can't believe the Shroud's medieval and I want to believe the Shroud's medieval. So I just have to trust them. That's not good enough. That's not rational. Okay. Now, obviously, so in terms of on that front, you can see, so he neglected three of the things, right? So he neglected the evidence for the invisible reweave hypothesis, things like the blue quad mosaic image, Ray Rogers and Al Adler's chemical findings of salt and that sort of thing, matter dye. I'm friends with Pam Moon, who investigated the sample at Oxford Labs in person, saying there is indeed this substance on the cloth and stuff like that. So there is evidence that should have been discussed here, but Michael Alter just in his chapter didn't cover this, apart from that one quote of Hugh saying, carbon-14 scientists say, no, it's part of the original cloth. I might as well say, well, okay, what are my reasons for thinking that the invisible reweave is false then? I have three reasons. Number one, in 2002, there was a textile restoration project by textile experts Methchal Fleur-Limburg and Irene Tomidi. Irene, I've reached out to her by email personally and invited her on my show, but she's in her 90s now, so unfortunately that couldn't happen. But just want to say, these people investigated the shroud with compound microscopes, removed the Holland backing cloth, looked at the back, and they couldn't see any evidence for an invisible reweave. Now, I know it's invisible, but it's impossible to be invisible. Anything created with the human hand as a weave will be visible when seen with modern scientific instruments and by qualified textile experts. It wasn't. The second reason, pro-shroud STIRP scientist, Dr. John Jackson, the head of STIRP, right? Roman Catholic, heavily pro-shroud, even he says there's absolute proof or disproof of this theory because there are horizontal striations that go from the main part of the cloth into the carbon-14 sections dated, meaning they're all part of the same cloth. It's not some new cloth woven in. Thirdly, nuclear engineer Bob Rucker has actually calculated mathematically that if for the invisible reweave hypothesis to be true, 86% of the material would have to be 16th century material and only 14% from the year 30 AD to arrive at the carbon-14 dating results that we got in 1989. The problem is, if it was 86% material, that would be evident. That patch or that reweave would be evident to the naked eye, and it's not. So those are my three reasons for dismissing this theory. But disappointingly, Alter doesn't give any reasons, and he just quotes Hugh Ferry and the Radiocarbon Journal paper of people, carbon-14 scientists, not textile experts, but carbon-14 scientists saying, no, it's a part of the original. We think it's part of the cloth, the original cloth. That's not really rational, in my opinion. 5, the material was deliberately switched, so he covers that. The laboratories deliberately falsified the results. Yes, he covers that. Okay, so contamination of the samples. He didn't really cover that option either, right? So there were various options here. Again, this is a highly improbable solution, but even Harry Gove admitted, along with Walter Macron, that there were lots of contamination, natural contamination, wax, tallow, smoke, fire, heat, touching, biological, organic, stuff like that. Tons of contamination in that area. And there's even proof that, okay, there's contamination of cotton in that area alone, not found in other areas of the shroud, for example. So it was heavily contaminated. The question is, did their cleaning procedures get rid of that contamination sufficiently or not? That's what the question is. But yeah, so here's the main one that I think Alter really needed to cover in his book. And it's that statistical problem. As I mentioned, I do find it odd that Alter should have entirely neglected to mention the statistical proof, now published in a total of 6 independent scientific peer-reviewed journals, including the Oxford-owned journal Archaeometry in 2017 by Tristan Casabianca. Even the peer reviewers back in 1989 warned of the journal Nature not to publish that they had a 95% degree of confidence based on the chi-square test, because such was unproven. And instead, we now know there is a 98.6% probability of a systematic bias affecting the results. It's not due to random measurement error, as was asserted in the paper in Nature in 1989. With this raw data now published, this is perfectly consistent with nuclear engineer Bob Rucker's his model based on using the MCNP computer software. This is the software used by the government of the United States of America, Monte Carlo Neutron Particle Computer Software Program. Bob Rucker worked for the government for 40 plus years in the nuclear industry as a world's expert in nuclear engineering. And because of that, he had access to this, probably the best computer software when it comes to neutrons in the entire world. And he used that at a perfect match to what we actually have with the carbon-14 data, proving the shroud must have been neutron irradiated. Let's just hear Bob Rucker speaking about this in his own words, and even having the ultimate shroud skeptic Hugh Ferry concurring that on this basis, shroud skeptics can't prove the shroud is medieval on the basis of carbon-14 dating versus a 30 AD date. We have to be agnostic. We don't know on the carbon-14 data alone. Let's play those clips now.
The British Museum finally released the data, I think in 2017 or so, under legal request, and so that the data could then be fully analyzed. Let me back up. This slide is about where the data was published. So it was published in a paper called Radiocarbon Dating of the Shroud of Turin by P.E. Damon and 20 others. So there was 21 people signing it, and that was in the highly revered journal Nature, February 16th, 1989. I'll point out the conclusion here. The results provide conclusive evidence that the linen of the shroud is medieval. But one of the 2 peer reviewers of this paper, Professor Bray, recommended deleting this conclusion, but the editor of Nature, a vocal atheist, decided to include it. The other peer reviewer basically said, this paper is not about statistical analysis, so we won't even go there. Well, it turns out that that's the main issue, is the statistical analysis of the data. So the recommendation of Professor Bray was just ignored. Okay, he didn't like this because he didn't feel like it was actually proven by the paper. Let's go on. So this is the data that was obtained. So we have 4 values from the laboratory in Tucson, Arizona. We have 5 values from the laboratory in Zurich, Switzerland, and we have 3 values from the laboratory in Oxford, England. Now you notice, and this is true for every experimental value that you get. You have actually 2 values. You have the value itself, and you have an uncertainty. So this gives the range that you would expect this value to have. I'll just leave it at that point. What's then done with this data in the paper that Damon and the others published was that the average value was then calculated based on certain type of statistical analysis. They came down to a value of 1260, an average value for the 3 laboratories of 1260 plus or minus 31 years. So that's the average value for the 3 laboratories, averaging their subsample dates, which was then corrected for the changing carbon-14 concentration in the atmosphere to arrive at a range of 1260 to 1390, which they then claimed to have a 95% confidence. But that's only true if you know this value with certainty, which you don't. Okay. So what I'm saying here is that when I calculate, I say all the black values are from Damon, published in Nature. And when I calculate the data, I obtained different values than the values shown in Damon. And I shouldn't. I should be able to calculate the values because they give me this data. So I calculate different values here, and when I average those three in red, I come up with 1277.8, which isn't all that much different than the 1260 value. But look at this, the uncertainty, 12.6 versus 31. That's a huge difference. And why is that? What is going on here? That is why this paper should be retracted. Okay, so now the important point here, when we look at this data, we just look at the data, look at the red values here. Tucson came up with a value of 1303.6, plus or minus 17, whereas Oxford came up with a value of 1200.8, plus or minus 30.7. So when you take this value minus this value, what you get is a difference of about 102.8, almost 103-year difference. But when you take the uncertainties and square them, add them, then take the square root, which is how you do it, you then arrive at uncertainty on that 103 value almost of about 35. So the difference between these two laboratories is 103, rounding off a little bit, plus or minus 35. Well, that means there's a statistically significant difference between the results of Tucson and Oxford. So in other words, the laboratories don't agree as to what the date was. Well, why is that? Something strange is going on. So if you take this data, if you take those three values and you plot them, this is what you get. Now, let me explain it. So what I'm doing here, I took the Tucson value and I put in what's called the 1 sigma standard deviation here. That would be this value, 103.6 plus or minus 17.1. And then I took the value for Zurich with a 1 standard deviation uncertainty, and then the value from Oxford. Now, you notice what the laboratory did, the British Museum did in their statistical analysis. They simply took those three values, averaged them, and obtained 1260. Well, that's the black line right here, but the black line only goes through one of the data points. That's strange, okay? And so that when I lay out a best fit line, do the mathematical analysis to get a best fit line, the best fit line, here's 35.86x, y equals 35.86x plus another value. But this gives the slope to that line. Now let's go into this a little bit further. On the y-axis, we have the carbon date that would be obtained. Okay, that's the y-axis. The x-axis is the distance from the bottom of the cloth. Okay, and this is in centimeters, which is there's 2.54 centimeters in an inch, so it's a fraction of an inch. So what I'm saying here is that the dates from the laboratories differ based upon the distance from the bottom of the cloth. And why is that? That has to be answered. You have to have a good answer for that. When the statistical analysis was done, when the actual data from the British Museum was published about 2017, there were 4 different papers that came out and were published in peer-reviewed papers, and all 4 of these analyses listed here concluded that the 1260 to 1390 average date should be rejected, that is, given no credibility. And there's different ways of saying this. In those 4 papers, there's 3 different equivalent ways to say this concept. And the way they said it was that the samples were heterogeneous. Heterogeneous means essentially not similar. They were essentially different. And they shouldn't be, because they were all cut from the same cloth. They should have been homogeneous. But the statistical analysis of that data indicates that the data is heterogeneous, essentially different, rather than homogeneous. So that therefore, the samples cannot be claimed to be representative of the entire cloth. Okay? Now, that's why the paper should be withdrawn. Okay? Now, second way that you can say it, and I prefer this way myself, that systematic error was present in addition to the normal random error. Every experiment you do and get a value, there are random errors. Random errors are small. They can be a little bit positive one time, a little bit negative another time. But if you take multiple measurements, the positive error would compensate the negative error. You take an average to minimize the effect of the random errors, and you get about the right answer. But a systematic error is basically different. This can be very large and all either positive or negative, so that they can be very large. So what I'm saying here, let me go on here. The next way to say this is that something else was being measured in addition to what you wanted to measure. That is, you were measuring the true date plus the systematic error, giving you the calculated carbon date. So the true date of 33 AD plus the systematic error of about 1,300 years.
There you have it. You can see, obviously, there's something up. But when it comes to the statistical problems, even the ultimate Shroud skeptic himself, Hugh Ferry, admits, well, on the basis of the carbon-14 dating, in light of these statistical issues, you can't prove that the Shroud is in fact medieval or is from 30 AD. We just don't know on the basis of the carbon-14 dating alone. Now, Hugh Ferry believes the Shroud is in fact medieval on the basis of what he calls outside evidence, things like the textile evidence. Michael Alter gets into that later in his chapter, or other, the D'Arcis Memorandum, stuff like that. But on the carbon-14 data alone, in explanatory isolation, just looking at the carbon-14 data, so the average dates obtained, right, the dates for the 12 subsamples, the range of dates, and the slope, the gradient of the subsamples, 36 years per centimeter as the slope or the gradient of those 12 subsample average dates. On that data alone, that can either be explained due to, well, maybe there was a difference in the cleaning techniques of one or more of the labs, and that's why they've all screwed up. They're all screwed up. Tucson is different than Oxford, and that's why they're heterogeneous. This is pure speculation on Hugh's part. There is absolutely no proof this actually happened. And in fact, all the proof we have from the testimony of Dr. Harry Gove, the carbon-14 scientist who invented the technique and was in charge of, to some degree, of dating the Shroud itself, working with Michael Titan, that sort of thing. He said, no, all the cleaning procedures were the exact same at all three labs. So who's lying? For 30 plus years, we heard from all the skeptics, oh, you can trust the carbon-14 dating scientists. They wouldn't be so incompetent as to have different cleaning procedures. They were consistent and uniform. They did their jobs perfect. Now, statistical proof, mathematical proof, they fudged the data and screwed up. And now, all of a sudden, Hugh Ferry's saying, post hoc rationalization. Well, maybe there were some differences in the cleaning procedures. Maybe that's why they're different. We have no proof that happened or that made a difference. But on the other end, we have a 30 AD cloth, neutron irradiated at the time of Jesus' resurrection through neutron irradiation. Perfect, making a 30 AD cloth date to the medieval period when it's not, in fact, medieval. And again, when it comes to these two options, even Hugh says we have to be agnostic. We can't decide except for on the basis of outside evidence, outside of the carbon-14 data itself.
So you know something seriously wrong with the measurements.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. But I'd also say that one way of explaining the difference in the different radiocarbon ratios might be neutron radiation. Or it might be a very small area of contamination with, say, a hydrocarbon of using terrestrial carbon in it, which has made the date of the oldest sample older than it really than it ought to be.
Yes, but this didn't show up in comparison to the standards that were run, and you can see that in the significance level of 90%, 50, and 30%. Is far above the 1.4 that they obtained. There was something else going on.
Well, as I say, the last paper, statistical analysis, the Lawrence and Schwab paper, did you read that?
Yes.
They decided that it could be that there was the Oxford cleaning process had resulted in some residual contamination, either that was making the Oxford sample too old, or the other two samples too young.
Yes. Now, from a scientific standpoint, that should be considered as an option that would then produce a hypothesis that would lead to testing. Now, that's what I'm doing. I'm using the values, and I'm making the assumption that the cleaning process was so extreme, and it was that you're boiling these samples in hydrochloric and sulfuric acid. You're boiling them so that where you end up with less than 50% of the material remaining. That would clean it. Yes. And so my hypothesis here is that the measurements, the measured values of carbon-14 to carbon-12 were accurate. And that is what then motivates me to come up with this vertically collimated radiation burst hypothesis, which adequately explains and is consistent with image formation, carbon dating, and the dried blood now being on the shroud.
Yeah, I follow that. It's just that I think that the contamination hypothesis presented by the Schwab and Lawrence paper is also valid. And that's the hypothesis that I would work on.
I was originally doing these calculations with the idea that we had 3 data points, that we had the date, we had the slope and the range of the values on the Shroud of Turin. And after I finished the calculations, I thought I was done, it then occurred to me, no, we have a 4th point. We have the dating for the sudarium. Well, where's the most likely place for the sudarium to be located? Well, it occurred to me the most likely place, the person who was doing the burial, the body would be brought in, put on the bottom half of the cloth. The person doing the burial, I like to think it was the Apostle John, then took off the face cloth. And what would he have done with it? Well, most people are right-handed. He'd just drop it even with his body. So I thought, okay, let's look in my calculations, even with the body on the right bench. And when I looked there, it gave me a date of 700 AD. And what was the laboratory's dates on the sudarium? About 700 AD. So it's a confirmation that my calculations were right. And this hypothesis is right.
Yeah, that sounds like I hadn't read your latest version in which the neutron radiation was also collimated as it left the body. I think that was that's fairly new, isn't it? That's recent.
Yes, it really doesn't make too much difference, because once the neutrons get into the limestone, they bounce around enough that the overall distribution of the neutrons really depends more on the shape of the body and the shape of the limestone in the tomb.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll follow that. No, that's very interesting. That's new to me. So thank you.
Yes. Okay.
Awesome. Okay. Cool. So just for the audience to understand where we kind of stand. So let me just share the screen again. In terms of those, oops, go too far ahead. So in terms of these things that I covered in my Shroud Solo Show Part 1, we're all agreed that the first 3, well, actually, no, we're not. So the first 2 shouldn't affect anyone's believing in the 1988 carbon-14 dating results or not. On number 3, at least bracketing out the overlap between Bob Rucker's statistical thing, Bob says that it shouldn't make a difference one way or the other. Hugh says, well, it should lower your confidence, but just a little bit. It's still more probable than not, and that you should believe in the carbon-14. Now we're here on number 4. This is really what Bob and Hugh have been debating here. And now Bob has been clear that, look, this aspect should destroy your confidence. You should be, at the very least, agnostic, or he's presented through his mechanism, you should believe that the shroud is not medieval on the basis of the carbon-14 results. Hugh, I want to get from you. So are you saying that what Bob is saying here is kind of an equally probable explanation? Should we be agnostic?
No, well, Yeah, it's Bob's explanation fits the data, which I think is fine, and he's right. It does account for other ideas, not at least, or it can do, and for possible ideas, and it is testable. So, in that sense, it's a thoroughly commendable hypothesis. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I don't find, on the basis of other evidence regarding the shroud, that it's likely, and I think it's more likely to be a bit of residual contamination, and would pursue that. And I suppose we will find out eventually, when various bits are studied at more detail, either the rice sample, if any bits of it are still available, would show the gradient moving away. But I think it should be studied in terms of the contamination that's on it, and whether the application of ether as part of the cleaning agent and all that sort of thing can affect the radiocarbon content of various bits of the cloth. And from Bob's point of view, you just need to grab a tiny thread from anywhere in the middle of the shroud, and it'll date far into the future. And that would be a good way of discriminating between our two hypotheses.
Cool. So just kind of finishing this part off then with Hugh, because I just want to, I understand Bob's position, and my position is the same as his, that this represents, what Bob is saying here represents an undercutting defeater. It undercuts someone's justification for saying the shroud is medieval, or probably medieval, 51% or more, on the basis of the 1988 carbon-14 dating alone, the empirical data. Now, you said you agreed with that. That means that the only reason you're maintaining that on the basis of the 1988 carbon-14 dating is on the basis of outside evidence. So by that, what did you mean by that? Is it something that's related to the empirical dating of the shroud?
Yes.
Or is it like you're
talking the shroud was quite likely to be medieval long before the carbon date, and the carbon date confirmed that it was medieval. I mean, from my point of view.
So there you have it. The ultimate shroud skeptic, Hugh Ferry himself, said, yes, we should be agnostic. We can't prove the shroud is probably 51% or more medieval on the basis of the carbon-14 data alone in explanatory isolation. The only reason we can privilege that it's confirming evidence of a medieval date is on the basis of outside evidence, by which he means evidence that existed before the carbon-14 ever existed, such as the D'Arcis Memorandum. We're going to look at that next. Michael Alter talks about that. Or the textile evidence, something like that. But on the basis of the carbon-14 data, the average dates, the range of dates, and the slope or gradient of the 12 subsample date carbon-14 dates, we don't have no clue whether it is in fact medieval, and the statistical problems are due to some kind of difference in the cleaning procedures, or equally probable, or perhaps, as Bob Rucker says, even more probable, but let's just keep it equally probable to keep things equal as a worst case scenario. Equally probable, according to Hugh Ferry, is no, the shroud dates to 30 AD, and it was bombarded by neutron radiation during the resurrection of Jesus, and therefore gave us a false carbon-14 medieval date, when in fact the shroud's actual calendar age is 30 AD. Bob Rucker points out we also have the carbon-14 date of the Sudarium of Oviedo. So if you assume if we look at outside evidence on the pro-shroud side, something that Michael Alter totally neglected was the Sudarium of Oviedo, which has been forensically proven to have covered the same corpse as the Shroud of Turin man. Based on the crown of thorn wounds and the bloody nose and anatomical and various blood flow patterns, it's been forensically proven that the shroud and the Sudarium covered the same corpse, and the only place those two cloths could have corresponded was Jerusalem. Sounds like Jesus to me. And the Sudarium gave us a carbon-14 date of 700 AD. Perfect fit with Bob Rucker's neutron radiation hypothesis and his MCNP computer calculations based on the location of the Sudarium being placed to the side at the time of neutron irradiation. At the time of the resurrection, they took the Sudarium off Jesus' face and put it to the side, just like the Gospel of John tells us. And based on that, Bob calculates we would get around a 700 AD date. What do you know? They carbon-14 date the Sudarium of Oviedo, just so happens to give us a 700 AD date, just like the neutron hypothesis. Now that's a way of saying, well, probably Hugh is wrong. Probably the shroud is not medieval. It must have been dated to 30 AD and was neutron irradiated as per Bob's hypothesis. But that's on the basis of outside evidence. It's evidence from outside the carbon-14 data of the shroud itself. In terms of the carbon-14 data, there are 3 bits of data, and that's it. The average dates, 1260 to 1390, the range of dates, somewhere in the 1100s all the way up to 1400s, and then that slope, that gradient of the 12 subsample C14 dates, which is 36 years for every centimeter you move in. The cloth gets younger by 36 years. That's the data we got in 1989, 1988, and 1989 from carbon-14 dating the shroud. Now, if we're going to appeal to outside evidence to help us, well, yeah, pro-shroud guys can refute Hugh's outside evidence, and they can present their own outside evidence, such as the link to the Sudarium. Or as Dr. Thomas McAvoy in the Applied Optics journal has scientifically proven, Bob's MCNP computer calculation model perfectly fits the data from the shroud taken in 1978 from the ultraviolet fluorescence curve. Again, proof that the shroud was neutron irradiated and therefore it dates to 30 AD. It does not date to the medieval period as shroud. So if we want to include outside evidence to help us to adjudicate, it's the pro-shroud side that wins. That shroud is 1st century, absolutely scientifically proven. Hugh's speculative outside evidence I've refuted time and time again. And we'll get to one of those, the D'Arcis Memorandum, next, kind of thing, because that's Michael Alter's next thing. But I just want you to get that point. In terms of the carbon-14 data on the shroud, those 3 bits of data alone, Hugh says, yes, we should be agnostic. Now we're moving on from the carbon-14 proper to the D'Arcis Memorandum. Michael Alter argues next that there are no definitive historical records of the shroud's existence before the 14th century. I just asked, why specify definitive as the standard? Because no PhD historian in the world would disqualify historical documents simply because one may raise doubts about them. You don't need definitive historical records. While such are preferable or they're ideal, a lot of times in history you have to work on the preponderance of evidence as your standard of proof. For crying out loud, there are people who deny the Holocaust ever happened and say the videos are faked. That's at least possible. It's extremely improbable. I think it's proven beyond all reasonable doubt, but it's still possible. So it's not absolutely definitive. Look, Julius Caesar, the reports Julius Caesar gives of the Gallic Wars, none of that is absolutely definitive in terms of a historical record, right? No, historians work with evidence on a balance of probabilities. This probably happened, or it's very probable it happened, or this is very improbable to happen, unlikely to happen. This is the operation of historians. So I think it's just a false standard to claim that we're looking for definitive historical records for the shroud's pre-medieval or pre-14th century existence. That's kind of a bias. That's not fair. And when it comes to the D'Arcis Memorandum, we don't even that's not definitive. There are shroud skeptics who say the shroud, those documents, the D'Arcis Memo and other documents from the 14th century aren't talking about the Shroud of Turin, talking about something else. And it's actually the Shroud of Turin didn't come into existence until Leonardo da Vinci, who created it as a self-portrait. There are skeptics who will claim that. Does that mean that the D'Arcis Memorandum is not a definitive historical record, or that historians can't say that, yeah, we'll see, it probably dates to the 14th century? Of course not. Of course not. So that's the first point. Michael Alter continues on. The first reference to the shroud dates to 1390. This is actually outdated info. I did a show with Jack Marquardt, pro-shroud historian Jack Marquardt versus Hugh Ferry, on a new document that was just published in a peer-reviewed journal of history, medieval history, I think, by Andrea Nicolati's student, Nicholas something. Sarzejad. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. But we have another bishop from 1370 to the late 1380s, Bishop Oresime, who also says this. So again, this just came out this year, so I don't expect Michael Alter isn't at fault. He wrote his book in 2021 or 2020, I believe, 2021, I think it was. So of course he didn't know about this newest finding. Nonetheless, so he says it dates to 1390 when the Bishop of Troyes, Pierre D'Arcis, wrote a letter to the Pope in Avignon, Clement VII, telling him that a noble family in his diocese was displaying a relic for veneration, and it was in fact a fake. And he says that it was proven as such about 34 years ago, not 35, but 34 years ago or earlier when it was exposed as such during an investigation by the then Bishop of Troyes, Henry de Poitiers. So this is Bishop D'Arcis's immediate predecessor, whereby during an official inquisition or inquiry, an artist confessed to having painted the Shroud of Turin. In response, Pope Urban VI in Rome said that the shroud basically they had a bias for the D'Arcis family, and clearly they knew that this inquiry proved the shroud was a fake, and that's why they were told to stop declaring the shroud to be a genuine article and to call it just a representation. So this is on pages 121 to 122 of Alter's chapter on the shroud in his book on the resurrection. Okay, so I think Alter does pretty good at listing out the main points on each side here. So he lists a defense of the pro-shroud proponents who argue that the letter is complete bunk. So number one, the paper was just an unsent, unofficial draft. Pro-shroud guys also say D'Arcis gives no evidence of an investigation or the alleged confession by the artist. 3, the D'Arcis letter misstates the facts. It says that it was painted, but we know scientifically for a proven fact it was not painted. 4, the D'Arcis family owned the shroud and successfully challenged D'Arcis's authority in the diocese. So D'Arcis's motivation may have been to undercut the authority of D'Arcis. And finally, 5th, the bishops were corrupt, and their animosity for devotion was jealousy and greed. So the pro-shroud side, we know we say that. Yeah, it's a projection. Beloved D'Arcis was so greedy. He didn't like money going to a church outside of his controlled jurisdiction. So he wanted the pilgrims coming to him, and he was trying to steal the shroud so that he could display it in his own cathedral to make money. But then Alter cites Thurston, who concisely details 4 arguments for rejecting the authenticity of the shroud. So number 1, we possess nearly a score of documents which have some direct or indirect bearing on the facts reported in this memorial or this memo. 2, a more important confirmation is to be found in the fact that Pierre D'Arcis describes the shroud as fabricated in the time of his predecessor. It curiously happens that the history of the supposed relic for 1,300 years down to that precise date remains an absent, that neither the evangelists, the fathers, the Oriental travelers, nor any of the apocryphal writings speak of it before the 14th century. The Pope's decision was that when the cloth was shown, there was to be no elaborate ceremonial, no vestments or lights or other observances customary of veneration of relics. Finally, 4, but the most damning and conclusive piece of evidence, one which Canon Chevalier himself, it seems to me, has hardly given sufficient prominence, is the undoubted fact that Geoffrey de Charny and the canons had never ventured to maintain to the Pope that their shroud was in fact an authentic relic. And this is on pages 122 to 124. All right, so by way of assessing the D'Arcis memorandum, so on the pro-shroud side, Alter, so remember the first thing is the paper was just an unsent, unofficial draft. Now, this is absolutely true. It's undeniable, historically speaking. In fact, we're not even sure we have the original draft itself. Under the bibliographical test, we only have 2 manuscript copies or folios, and they're both different from each other. some people have said, well, the scribe is signed at the back, so we do have the original drafts, and maybe they were working on edits and stuff like that. But the facts are, we have these unsent. They were unsigned and undated. We have no record. I'm friends with pro-shroud historian, PhD Dr. Cheryl White, a professional historian who's had access to the Vatican archives. There's nothing in there about these memos at all, despite the fact that all of our other evidence is signed and dated. And this is what she had to say.
So the other thing, I know you hate talking about D'Arcis, but I just have to take advantage of your knowledge. Because I was recently scolded by a bunch of Shroud skeptics. So I just raised a question, a historical question about because we have two manuscript folios in the parish. That's all we have under the bibliographical test. And I raised the question, how do we know these are actually the originals? Like, do we have evidence or proof these are originals, or are these a 15th century manuscript copy and stuff? So
They're copies.
They're not the originals. Oh, okay.
No, they completely appear to be copies, and I think that there's good sort of scholarship behind that. We're lacking a chain of custody for it, number one, and number two, we don't even really know if D'Arcis really ever sent it. That's the other thing, because in context, the Pope, it's Clement the Sixth, Clement the Seventh.
Oh, okay.
Who is responding to the issue of its authenticity and allowing it to be displayed, but that it cannot be displayed as the authentic burial cloth of Christ, right? That's kind of his response. But if you read the Pope's response, it sort of in context with the D'Arcis memorandum, I have difficulty even linking those two documents together. Like he doesn't specifically mention it. He doesn't directly address anything that D'Arcis has reported. And the other thing that bothers me about that, about the D'Arcis memorandum, is that he calls it a painting. And we know it's not a painting. I mean, that's been scientifically proven. So I'm not even sure we're talking about the same object.
So that's fascinating. So that's great to get confirmation from a PhD historian. Take that, you skeptics.
Take that, you skeptics.
Just one last follow-up, if you don't mind. So one thing they did retort is they said, well, we've proven that they're the originals because they're written specifically in 14th century Latin, 14th century style, like linguistically. Obviously, you've said that's not true. These are later. Do you have a response to that? Do we know when the copies come from or anything like that?
Well, I mean, I could not say with certainty where the copies come from, but I'll tell you this, that making a linguistic argument is a little bit beyond my reach. Okay, I'm not a linguist, but I will tell you that my rudimentary understanding of medieval Latin would have me to conclude that the Latin language does not change much after classical Latin is gone with the fall of the Western Roman Empire. We don't have much change in the Vulgate Latin for centuries. So I'm not even sure that's, and I would defer to a linguist if you had one and could confirm that, but I'm not sure that anyone would see a difference between 14th century Latin and 15th century Latin, to be quite honest. And the other thing is that we know copies were made all the time. Copies of things were made, and we have it in two different places. So there are two manuscripts, but that is not proof that one of them is the original and one of them's a copy. They could both be copies. And so the original would have survived, I think, had it been sent, would have survived in a papal archive. That's the way these things happen. And they haven't. So, and again, contextually, and this might make a good paper now that I'm thinking about it. Contextually, if you look at the Pope's response, what's purported to be his response, I don't think he's responding directly to D'Arcis. I think he's just responding to the fact that there's a relic that's being displayed purported to be the burial shroud of Christ. There's a warning. Don't display it as authentically the burial shroud, but it's worthy of veneration. So, There's actually a paper in that, Dale. Thank you for giving me something else to think about.
Once in a while, they come in handy. You know,
Yeah, once in a while, you send a historian off on another tangent.
there we go. I'm like Costanza. I get the one off, and then that's it.
Yeah.
And here's beloved Hugh Ferry debating Dr. Cheryl White, the professional historian. And Hugh Ferry, the ultimate Shroud skeptic himself, has to admit, yeah, the D'Arcis Memo is pretty garbage evidence. I don't even want to use it in a debate because I know it will get ripped apart to shreds and destroyed by a knowledgeable historian like Cheryl.
Yeah, I'll be very brief, which probably means I'll be too quick. From a historical point of view, no, I'd like to ignore the D'Arcis Memorandum. I'd like to pretend it didn't happen, that the bloke who wrote it didn't exist, and if he did, he didn't send it, and all the rest of it.
So there you have it. Even Hugh Ferry is admitting, this D'Arcis Memo isn't all it's cracked up to be by Shroud skeptics online and that sort of thing. So, and they confirm, yep, it wasn't sent, it wasn't signed or dated. It's not good evidence compared to the other historical documents we have, all signed and dated around the same time. Secondly, D'Arcis, this is the most important thing. This is the only thing I care about. D'Arcis gives no evidence for an investigation or an alleged artistic confession. Once again, this is absolutely true. Some claim that this means the pro-Shroud side is merely pure speculation. But I just want to, on this front, I just want to cite Christopher Hitchens' razor. That which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. And it's the skeptic who bears the burden of proof alone here. You have to prove that there is an investigation, that there was an artist that actually confessed. And simply citing a very dubious document, which all PhD historians are skeptical of, unless they've got a bias against the Shroud, that's not good enough evidence. And if it is, well, then the heck with the Shroud. We don't need it. I'll just give for Michael Alter, I'll just give you the Gospel of Mark. That's a document that was written roughly 40 years after the event. And it says Christianity is true and that Jesus rose bodily from the dead and stuff like that. And you should just believe whatever is in this thing because I have a document that says this happened from 40 years after the event. So skeptics need to be consistent here. If you're going to dismiss the Gospel of Mark, showing Christianity is true, Jesus is God in the flesh, and he rose bodily from the dead on the third day after his crucifixion, where he died to atone for our sins. If you're going to deny that, then you have to deny D'Arcis Memorandum unless you have reasons that support D'Arcis Memo versus the other. So you can't just put it off and say, oh, well, the pro-Shroud's denials are just pure speculation. No, the truth is we have claims in a document. There was an inquiry and that an artist confessed, but we have no proof that that's actually true any more than I can say, well, look, it's written in black and white in your Gospel of Mark. Jesus did miraculous healings. Jesus claimed to be God in the flesh kind of thing. Jesus died and rose from the dead. It's right there in black and white. You've got to believe it, right? So it's not that simplistic is what I want to say here. And it's very telling. There is no evidence provided. Bishop D'Arcis was a very meticulous lawyer. In his other documents, he cites names, specific names, dates, specific dates, not just vague, about 4 years ago or thereabouts. I have no clue when this happened, but maybe 34 years ago, something like that. Unlike that, he gives specific dates and times and gives specific quotes. These are all legal standards that we would expect from Bishop D'Arcis. And he gives out everywhere else he writes, just not in this case. It's probably because he's making it up. It never happened. That's what I would suspect here. And in fact, not one of the other primary documents, not a single one that we have about 9 other documents dating between 1355 to 1390, including the D'Arcis Memo. And aside from the memorandum, none of them, zip, duda, bubkiss, mention an inquiry or an artist confessing to painting the Shroud in 1355. Now, had an official inquiry been sent, all of these documents, or at least the later ones dating from 1389 to 1390, would have to, by precedent, give quotes and cite the inquiry where the artist confessed. They don't do that. There are no names, there are no specific quotations, no dates at all for this inquiry. And this is clearly a case where we would expect evidence to be there. And the absence of evidence, therefore, proves the evidence of absence in this case. So, unfortunately for Shroud Skeptics and Michael Alter, I think this specific factor is the Achilles heel that destroys the Shroud Skeptics' claim that the Shroud is medieval on this front. 3, the D'Arcis letter misstates the facts. It says that the Shroud was painted, but that's not true. This is absolutely true. And I thank Michael Alter for admitting this. I like that he is trying his best to be objective and neutral on the D'Arcis memorandum. And he's saying, look, yeah, we have scientific disproof. D'Arcis was full of it. The Shroud was not painted. Therefore, an artist could not have confessed to having painted the Shroud. Scientifically proven fact. Every Shroud skeptic in the world, including Hugh Ferry, would laugh at anyone who says the Shroud is just a traditional painting. Walter Macron's hypothesis has been refuted. No one in the entire world has ever believed that since his death in 2002, I believe is when Dr. Macron died. He took his theory with him. Even Shroud skeptics who believe the Shroud is some kind of artistic medieval artwork, none of them would dare to say, well, yeah, it's a painting, just like D'Arcis said. No, we've scientifically falsified that. And I did an entire panel review with Hugh Ferry on Walter Macron's traditional painting hypothesis, whereby he admits Macron was wrong. D'Arcis was wrong. This is not a traditional painting at all. But it gets even worse because D'Arcis has been disproven on even his main claim about this inquiry held by his predecessor, Bishop Henry de Poitiers. We actually have proof because we have a letter signed and dated specifically May 28th, 1356, from signed Bishop Henry de Poitiers, the one who allegedly held this inquiry. Does he talk about an inquiry into the Shroud of Turin? Does he mention an artist? No, he contradicts the D'Arcis memorandum. He doesn't just not mention stuff. He says it didn't happen. There was no such thing. I am directly contradicting this D'Arcis memo and his lies before he even knew it, right? So this is what he says. May 28th, 1356. This is just a few months before he died that same year in September of 1356. And he directly contradicts the D'Arcis memo's claims. Instead, he praises Geoffrey for his piety and the Leary Church's exhibition of the Shroud by saying, quote unquote, as we have been informed by legal documents. Informed by legal documents? I thought Bishop Henry was informed by an official inquiry in person investigating the Shroud and hearing witness. I guess that never happened. Instead, he's just been informed about the goings on at the Leary Church through legal documents. And what does he say about this? We praise, ratify, and approve of the divine cult of showing the Shroud of Turin of this sort at your church. He praises, ratifies, and approves. This is incredible, folks. This is a direct contradiction. And in fact, my friend, pro-Shroud historian Jack Marquardt, raised this issue to the ultimate Shroud skeptic Hugh Ferry during his debate on debating the medieval documents. And even Hugh was kind of flabbergasted and didn't know how to respond to this.
At a time that, and I'm sure we'll get to this, we better get to it, but where there's a church canon 62 that says you can't do this without the approval of the Pope. So either this cleric has gone to the Pope in some way, that's going to take time, or he's doing it in violation of the canon at that time. And then you have to have the rest of D'Arcis' story happen. There's got to be enough exhibitions that Bishop Henry gets irritated or concerned about what is happening. He's got to commence an investigation. He's got to find an artist who confesses to having painted the image on the shroud. He's then got to convene a council of wise men of the law and theologians, and then he has to start proceedings against the dean for the dean to be fearful enough to take the relic and hide it. And this really all has to happen in the midst of all this anarchy that is happening, and probably be completed by June the 5th of 1357. Why that date? Well, there's another document here that is rarely mentioned. I'm going to guess you that you probably are at least aware of it. And that is that on June the 5th of 1357, a pontifical curia connected with the Pope in Avignon issues a pontifical bull. And in that bull, they deal with Lyrae, and they grant to Lyrae all of these extended indulgences, which really, I don't want to digress into this now, but it kind of puts the lie to everything that D'Arcis has said, because all these things were happening, you would not have this pontifical curia giving increased indulgences to Lyrae. But they say that one of the ways that the visitors to the church at Lyrae can earn these indulgences is to visit the relics, plural. It says nothing about the Turin shroud. It doesn't say to visit the great shroud that's there or the shroud that has been exhibited. So it's fairly well clear that whenever the shroud was there, at whatever time it was exhibited, it was not there as of June of 1357. And yet you would have all these things happen somewhere between Geoffrey's death in September of 1356 and this pontifical bull in June of 57. And those things just could not have happened that way. Nor, if you believe D'Arcis, could there be pilgrims coming from all around the world to visit Lyrae and go back to their countries while the countryside is being raided and the French government cannot provide safety to these pilgrims that are coming. So that's where I think that the historical context of what happened in Lyrae, I really wonder, I mean, seriously, I know that you're arguing a non-authenticist case here, but do you seriously believe that the scenario laid out in which the exhibitions don't take place until after Geoffrey's death, and it's the dean that's involved in that, rather than they took place 2 years earlier and they're orchestrated or at least approved by Geoffrey? Do you think that second scenario, the later scenario, actually has more plausibility than the former?
That's a very good point. No, I think I think it's possible now. I think you're quite likely correct that the shroud was exhibited before the Battle of Poitiers. But that still, to me, it doesn't necessarily mean that Geoffrey de Charny was there. Obviously, he was off fighting his.
Yes.
But I don't see it being exhibited much before 1356. I certainly wouldn't see it being exhibited in 1350.
Why wouldn't you see it being exhibited? You know, what we do know from the historical records, from the papal records, is that they were locked and loaded to do the shroud expositions as of October the 16th of 1354. That is when Geoffrey de Charny had chosen his 6 canons, and they had elected the Lyrae dean, and all the preliminaries were in place. So you wouldn't have had the expositions unless the canons were there to be able to run them. So they're in place by 1354. Why the assertion, I don't think it took place till 1356? Why couldn't they have taken place in 1354, 1355? And by the way, if they had taken place in 1355, you'd be right on the money with what D'Arcis said. He said this happened about 34 years ago, you know, give or take.
Yep.
But that's the date that he picked. That would be 1355. Geoffrey would be alive. He might not be there on a regular basis. He has to run up to northwest France and watch what's happening there. But sometimes these statements are made, and I just look at them and say, I don't know, but I don't think that you could say that there'd be any valid reason for saying that the exhibitions took place in 1356. And now, if you are somewhat agreeing that they may not have taken place after Geoffrey's death, well, then why do they have to take place in 1356? I think I know your reason, because you're troubled. I think you said in your last show when you talked about this, you're worried about the significance of Bishop Henry's letter in May of 1356, in which he's praising the divine cult that is at Liray. And it's referring to the cult of pilgrims who are coming to Liray and have been coming to Liray to venerate the shroud. But whatever the case, that basically says Henry's he didn't conduct an investigation before that, and he's not likely to conduct an investigation after that. But if he does, it must have to be after Geoffrey has passed away. That's where I think the non-authenticists are kind of in this corner. And I think their story would be a lot better if they would just kind of forget about the D'Arcis Memorandum, because the D'Arcis Memorandum doesn't really make a lot of historical sense given what the historical circumstances are at the time. So it's kind of a conundrum that I think that non-authenticists have about the very beginning of the history of the shroud, when they finally admit the shroud exists, that authenticists don't have. Our story is rather simple. You know, we used to have a show here in the United States that was called The Tonight Show way back when, and Johnny Carson would always say, if you buy the premise, you'll buy the bit. And there's just a false premise here. If you buy the authenticist premise that Geoffrey de Charnay is the owner of the shroud, got his church ready for exhibitions, and was ready to go in 1354, and the exhibitions took place over the next couple years, and there were no problems with them, and that's why the Bishop Henry praised them, praised Geoffrey, and praised the cult that was going on. This all makes historical sense, but it kind of then puts, and when I say puts the lie to the D'Arcis Memorandum, I'm not trying to indicate that D'Arcis lied necessarily. I just think it was a bunch of poor information that he had, that now that we're studying it, it just doesn't make very much sense in historical context.
Yeah, you make some good points.
He is not going to show a shroud in the light of Canon 62 without getting papal permission. Now, I believe that he received this papal permission, and I don't have to get to the circumstantial evidence. I'll simply say in that letter that Bishop Henry sent to Geoffrey de Charnay in May of 1356, he recites in there, we have been informed, we being being him, we have been informed by legitimate documents that this divine cult has been approved canonically and ritually, meaning pursuant to canon, and the rituals that are being performed there have also been approved. So I believe that in the first set of exhibitions, they were done pursuant to papal authorization.
So there you have it. Even the Shroud Skeptic was Ultimate Shroud Skeptic Hugh Ferry was a little flummoxed in light of Jack Marquardt's pervasive evidence here, and just citing this known, historically accepted letter. Everyone with a PhD in history accepts this as an authentic letter from Bishop Henry, and he's directly contradicting. He's saying, I approve of the divine cult of exhibiting the Shroud of Turin, just months in 1356 before Bishop Henry died. So even if you say, well, maybe he did it after May of he did it in June. They started showing the shroud in June of 1356. He died in September. That is not enough time to set up an official inquiry, do all that's required, and then for Bishop Henry to scold the Leary Church and get an artist to confess. It's just impossible for that to have been the case. So this letter contradicts the D'Arcis Memorandum and exposes the lies or the falsehoods, at the very least, that the D'Arcis Memo gives, and therefore it's garbage and rubbish evidence. Fourthly, the D'Arcis family owned the shroud and successfully challenged D'Arcis' authority. Okay. D'Arcis' motivation may have been to undercut the authority of D'Arcis. Sure. Or maybe there was also countless other unknown socio-political factors. So, for example, Jack Marquardt lists at least 17 different historical hypotheses covering this medieval period. And so, for example, in his case, he talks about how the Eastern Byzantine Empire and the Roman Catholic Church, basically the Byzantine emperor at this time was a secret Roman Catholic and considering rejoining or reunifying the two churches, the Orthodox versus the Catholics, which had been split since 1054 during the Great Schism. And this is one solution, Jack Marquardt says, explains why the Pope is saying just call it a representation and stuff like that. It gets into a whole theory or hypothesis as to external circumstances here. So that there's a whole bunch of issues going on that can explain this fact. And yeah, I don't see any issue here. 5, the bishops were corrupt, the animos. Now, I will say this, perhaps, because we know that D'Arcis' memo is lying and making stuff up. That's 100% proven fact, historically proven fact at this point. Jack tries to say, well, maybe he just had bad information. Where would he get that information from? I don't know. But my personal opinion is that D'Arcis is lying and exaggerating. But I used to say he was totally corrupt and just projecting his own faults onto the Leary Church because he charges them of greed and avarice. And I was saying, well, that's him. That's why he's trying to steal the shroud and get all the money for his greedy little self by showing it and stuff like that. I've actually changed my mind on this based on the evidence because we now have a new finding called a Bishop Oresime, and he's written a document that was just discovered this year and translated, published in a peer-reviewed medieval history journal. Nicholas Skarsgård, I think is the name. That's the wrong name, but something like that. I did a show on it, a debate between Jack Marquardt and Hugh Ferry on this document. But a bishop named Oresime basically said the same thing. He didn't mention an inquiry or an alleged confession or any of this, but he did mention that the Shroud of Turin is a known fake that's going around and stuff like that. And we ought not to be taken in by such foolishness and stuff. That's basically all he said. And again, giving the most charitable light for the Shroud skeptics, I'm happy to go, okay, maybe D'Arcis wasn't greedy and lying about everything. Maybe he sincerely did believe the Shroud was a fake, and he had a motivation to make sure people weren't venerating a fake relic. That could have been a sincere understanding. And because of that, okay, he made up some BS in an unofficial draft or something like that where he was planning to send it, but he had a scribe write it up, and then he realized, no, I can't send this to the Pope. I can't lie in this way, but, shoot. I really hope the Pope stops it and stuff like that. So there could have been a mixture of sincerity and lies. And I'm now open to that, seeing what Oresime said. Now, in the debate between Jack and Hugh on this new document, I do find that Jack raised a very important point that said, well, no, maybe Bishop D'Arcis is a liar and is corrupt and everything like this. This is still equally probable given our information. And he is the source of what Bishop Oresime says, because he's going around to his fellow bishops and spreading his lies to them. So Jack's argument is that we can't prove that these two bishops are independent of each other. We don't have multiple independent attestation. We just have somebody listening to D'Arcis and repeating his lies, and then D'Arcis writing his little draft in his memorandum around the same time. And again, a lot of historians date the Oresime document to 1370, but it's important to note that it can be in the 1380s as well. I think Jack places it around 1382 or somewhere in that ballpark. So yeah, it could be any time up to the late 1370, up to the late 1380s that Bishop Oresime wrote this one single sentence about the Shroud of Turin being a fraud and people should not believe it. Again, no mention of an inquiry, no mention of Bishop Henry having an artist confess or anything like this in this document either. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I think these reasons stand up, and if you're a Shroud skeptic, you should have zero warrant for believing the Shroud is medieval on the basis that the refutations are conclusive. But, okay, so Michael Alter on page 124 goes on and assesses some more issues. So on the 5 pro-Shroud arguments, so the fact that the Pope did not ban the devotion but regulated it does nothing to prove the bishops wrong. Okay, I agree with this. This is true. But it also does nothing to prove the bishops were right either. And since it is the Shroud skeptic, in this case Michael Alter, alone who is making a claim, he alone has the burden of proof. You have to prove it. You have to prove that they are in fact right. Right? No, why didn't he ban the devotion of, outright ban it? If it was just this fake and everybody knew it was a fake, why not outright ban the devotion altogether? Just because you're a family member, you're a pope, right? One issue I had is inconsistency with Michael Alter in his research on the resurrection, historical evidence for the resurrection and the scholarly consensus criterion. His main work is, he says, well, all of the English books, again, Gary Habermas goes beyond that. He looks at publications, books, and peer-reviewed journal papers and articles in French, German, and English. So Gary's set of material is far wider than what Michael Alter looked at. He just looked at English books, and he's upfront about this. Although he looks at all the books in English from 500 years ago up until today. Gary Habermas just looks at from 1975 to the present. So in that way, Alter is wider. But Alter's main argument is the vast majority of English resurrection books are written by Christians or people attending seminaries and stuff where we would expect them to be biased and want to publish pro-resurrection stuff because otherwise they'll be fired. And I just wanted to say this worldview bias argument, I don't think it works because, number one, Michael Alter provides actual proof in his table of Christians and seminary professors and stuff like that who publish on the contra resurrection side. They argue against the resurrection. So clearly it's not just automatic or necessarily true that because one's a Christian or because one is working at an institution that expects you to believe in a bodily resurrection, that therefore you're not going to print something. Michael Alter's research disproves that lie. It proves there are Christians of integrity who will print the truth as they see it. Or perhaps those Christians are corrupt and they're liberal Christians or something like that, and they're just making stuff up to be popular, to be the cool kid on the block. Like, hey, skeptics come and like me because I'm printing something that goes against Christianity. Aren't I cool? Who knows? The point is we can't get into the motivations of these authors just based on the basis of their worldviews. I think that doesn't really follow. And that, in terms of Michael Alter's argumentation, again, that's not the topic here. We're looking at the Shroud, but I just wanted to say, look, if we're just making stuff up, we could say, well, I would trust the Christians and not the liberals or the atheists, the contra sources, because Christians have a higher duty. Who cares if they will lose their job? They have a higher duty to God to preserve the truth. So therefore, we can expect, if you're a Christian, you're automatically telling the truth as to how you see the evidence. So if we're going to just argue from worldview bias, it can go either way. I just think it's an irrelevant factor. We have to judge on the basis of the substantive content. What are the reasons these people are presenting? Whether atheist, Christian, Muslim, whatever, we have to look at it all. And it's the same here with the Shroud of Turin and stuff, right? So yeah, we can't just assume that the motivations or knowledge of these people that are involved and whether they would be dishonest or not and stuff like that. We can prove that they had the opportunity or reason to be dishonest. Does that prove they actually were? No. So I would just be agnostic on this fact. It proves nothing, you know. Perhaps the Pope banned the devotion but regulated it for political reasons. 7, because the Catholic Church found the origin of the shroud fraudulent at that time, again, we've proven that's not true, or at the very least, that can't be proven true by the Shroud Skeptic. Alter says today's proponents must seek a way to refute this historical evidence since it supports the carbon dating results. Once again, so I just respond, Michael Alter provides no concrete definitive proof that the Catholic Church found the shroud's origin to be fraudulent. In fact, the opposite is the case. In fact, the opposite is the case when you actually know the historical documents involved that are relevant. Again, there's about 9 of them. 10 if you include the memorandum. Furthermore, all dating between 1355 and 1390. Furthermore, none other than Hugh Ferry himself has proven that the carbon-14 data directly contradicts the D'Arcis Memorandum. So I don't think Michael Alter knew this, but Hugh Ferry has an entire blog on this where the carbon-14 data rules out. It's scientifically impossible for the D'Arcis Memo to be true. The shroud and its images were not formed in the 1350s, mid-1350s. That's impossible given the carbon-14 data. In fact, it's most likely sometime between 1290 and 1320. That's what the carbon-14 data itself says. If we just take it at face value, again, we saw before that it's corrupted, can't be trusted. But if we just trust whatever the carbon-14 data says, well, then the D'Arcis Memorandum is directly contradicted by the carbon-14 because we know it's no later than 1320 when the shroud came into existence. 8, there is no concrete evidence that the shroud existed before the 1350s. Again, why concrete or absolute evidence? There's no concrete or absolute evidence that it dates to the 1350s. There are skeptics, Lynn Picnic and Clive Prince, for example, who say the shroud dates to the 1400s during Da Vinci's day. There are always room for doubts. There's always room for doubters, even if they're unreasonable doubters, right? There are people that doubt the Holocaust, as I said. So we have no concrete evidence that it's a 14th century thing either. There's always a way to raise doubts. And even Hugh Ferry himself claims in History and Science, we can never prove anything 100%. So this concrete, definitive, conclusive standard for evidence, whereby you mean 100%, is just unreasonable. When we look at, do we have evidence on a preponderance or the balance of probabilities, we've got tons of evidence showing the shroud probably predates the mid-1350s or predates the medieval period. There is sufficient evidence to argue for the shroud's pre-medieval history, and that's all we need. We don't need concrete evidence. We need sufficient evidence on the preponderance of evidence or balance of probabilities to go, yeah, probably the shroud predates the medieval period. And under that standard, we've got tons of proof. Okay, number 9, Harry Gov clarifies the character of the shroud's owner, Geoffrey de Charny. Now, I'm not sure about what this was about. I think he was trying to say that, well, Geoffrey de Charny, he must have known who made the shroud, therefore he was aware it was a fake, therefore he was a bad boy. And this contradicts what we know from history. Geoffrey I de Charny was a great guy. Everyone loved him. He was very honorable. Bishop Henry praised him, Geoffrey I, specifically for his piety and honor towards God and integrity. This is just historically disproven what Harry Gov said. And Harry Gov's a carbon-14 scientist and a biased atheist. He's not a qualified historian. Who cares what he thinks about Geoffrey de Charny? He was wrong. The third argument is the Hungarian Pray Codex. So this is the first pro-shroud evidence proving the shroud is not medieval. In fact, dates back at the latest to 1192 to 1196 AD. This is, of course, the famous Hungarian Pray Codex that I myself used to argue for. Now, on the pro-shroud side, so giving all of the evidences, he lists a couple of different ones. This is the most extensive. This is the one where I think that Michael Alter does a fair and balanced job in this section and evaluates the pros and cons fairly. And one of the pro-shroud side lists he gives based on 11 features. This is in the paper by Tristan Casabianca that I myself quoted when I assessed the Hungarian Pray Codex. And he says, look, there on the pro side, there are L-shaped poker holes. On the other side, there are decorative holes elsewhere. There's the crossed arms right over the left. There's the total nudity. There's the issue of the bloody stain. There's the herringbone weave. There are the long fingers, no thumbs. Against the authenticity, there's no sign of violence. There's no image on the sheet. And then there's the Psalter of Ingeborg, which I'll just say is Hugh Ferry's prior probability argument that there are similar scenes that look exactly the same, but they're a tomb lid, not a shroud cloth. And Alter quotes the shroud skeptic Colin Barry, who adds a caveat to ponder on this online discussion. Correlation does not imply causation. And I just answer and I say, yes, but sometimes it does, because causation necessarily implies correlation. So it's slogans aren't going to get us anywhere. We need better than this in terms of an assessment. So let's do that now. So let's look at each of these things. So Alter lists some skeptical objections. So number one, he lists Hugh Ferry, who says, quote unquote, indeed, the group of L-shaped holes does not seem to serve any other purpose, neither functional nor decorative, but as it is clearly on the lid of the sarcophagus. Now, this is true. Hugh Ferry on my show did confirm it doesn't serve a decorative or functional purpose. So this refutes and destroys other shroud skeptics who tried to say, well, maybe it's decorative or something like that. But notice how Hugh Ferry and Michael Alter are begging the question here. They're saying it's clearly the lid of the sarcophagus. Well, no, maybe it is the Shroud of Turin cloth. That's what the pro-shroud side is arguing. So we can't just simply beg the question. We need to provide reasons to think that this is that this is depicting the lid of a sarcophagus. Secondly, any resemblance between the codex and the shroud is purely subjective and coincidental. Again, this just is unsubstantiated bias and assertion only. There's no evidence or proof. This is just someone saying something, that it's just coincidental. That's just an unevidenced assumption. As to it being subjective, I think we do have to admit there is an element of subjectivity on both sides here. The artist is just not really good. And you'll see an image of the Hungarian Pray Codex. All right, so you can see the Hungarian Pray Codex has two panels here. So Jesus depicted as the shroud man in the Shroud of Turin, laying on the shroud as they prepare him for burial. And then here's the post-resurrection scene where this is the Shroud of Turin cloth with left behind with the three Marys and the angel. And from that, so as you can see, number 4, Michael Alter says, for 600 years, no one knew or mentioned of the connection and or the similarities between the codex and the shroud. And this is an interesting point. However, there can be various historical reasons for the lack of mention that are just obvious. Look, if you know the history of these two objects, there wasn't much time when they were together or opportunity would have raised, right? This is right near the end where the shroud supposedly disappears from Constantinople, then mysteriously arrives in Europe where nobody had a clue about the Hungarian Pray Codex per se. And the Hungarian Pray Codex was separated off and made by an artist. So where would we expect there to be mentioned that, oh yeah, the Hungarian Pray Codex and the shroud, they're the same? I mean, the shroud is supposedly the impetus for the artistic Pantocrator image. There's no mention of a similarity there or similarity between it and anything. So this is just the absence of evidence is evidence of absence fallacy that a lot of skeptics like to make. the fact that the connection wasn't mentioned is totally irrelevant. We wouldn't expect it to be mentioned. Now, this is the last point, number 5, is the best thing against the L-shaped poker holes, because I thought this is the strongest pro-shroud argument, and I think Colin Berry raises an interesting point. He says that the L-shaped arrangement of the poker holes seen in the Pray tomb illustration has, quote-unquote, almost certainly nothing whatsoever to do with the shroud, and everything to do with simple laws of randomness and probability. And I admit, this is something that I had never considered as a factor myself before. So this is on page 127 and 128. So I found this interesting. Let's listen to this. So, quote unquote, this is a comment from Colin Berry on Dan Porter's blog at this link, A Masterly Demolition of the Hungarian Pray Manuscript. And Colin Berry, back in 2012, says this, quote unquote, it's a simple matter to show that if you place 4 little circles or points at random on a sheet of parchment or paper, then the most probable pattern where the letters of the alphabet are concerned is an L. Why? Well, think about it. Any letter with a curve can straightaway be eliminated because 4 points are simply not sufficient to define a curve in 11 letters of the alphabet. That leaves just 15 straight-sided letters, but 9 of those, A, E, F, H, and I, with bars to distinguish from the number 1, K, M, W, and X, need at least 5 or more points to make them. That just leaves us with 6 feasible letters, L, N, T, V, Y, and Z. N and Z are highly improbable, needing 4 defining points at the corners of a rectangle with its 4 right angles. Y and T are also rather improbable, requiring the lowest point to be precisely positioned relative to the other 3, with T especially improbable since the top 3 points need to be in a straight line. That leaves just L and V, but one cannot make a symmetrical V with 4 points, 3 as distinct from 4 being needed. That means there is one letter that is uniquely most probable if one places our points at random on paper, the letter L. So this was an interesting thing. Just saying random chance would explain why it happens to look like an L, given the assumption that somebody wanted to randomly put 4 dots on the thing. But I think that's where the Achilles heel is. Why would someone purposefully want to put 4 random dots or circles for no reason at all, randomly? No, an artist would have a reason for doing it. And as Hugh Ferry, the ultimate Shroud skeptic, says, they serve no apparent functional or decorative purpose. And he has to speculate maybe they're holes for pegs, which is highly implausible to be the case, right? So what are these things? Colin Berry's solution is very interesting, but I don't think it really solves I don't think it serves as a refutation on its face, because we still have to ask this question, why would the artist want to randomly distribute 4 circles in the middle of a cloth and or in the middle of a tomb for no decorative or functional purpose? But there's also a second question Colin Berry misses. And if we look at the L-shaped holes here, they just so happen to correspond to where they were found on the Shroud of Turin. It's in the same relative location or area of where it would appear on a folded up Shroud of Turin. You also have to ask that. That's not just likely to come about randomly as well. So Colin Berry, I think, makes a really good point that we need to consider and take seriously and that sort of thing, but it still doesn't answer the question of it's how unlikely it is an artist would just randomly choose to use 4 dots for no reason at all. And secondly, that they would just randomly put that series of 4 dots shaped like an L in around the same relative location that it's found on the actual Shroud of Turin. Highly implausible. So I don't think Colin's answer totally solves the issue of the L-shaped poker holes. What about the herringbone weave? Michael Alter says that there is no representation of herringbone weave in the top Pray manuscript picture. Detractors argue that these are gravestone ornaments. Readers can find similar ornaments on other gravestone medieval representations. So he's citing Hugh Ferry here, specifically depicting onyx marble on some tombs. So here's an example of onyx marble from Hugh Ferry's British Society for the Turin Shroud newsletter 83. And here's a picture of onyx marble being depicted on a tomb with squiggly lines and stuff like that. And they're trying to say, well, that's comparable to the Hungarian Pray Codex. Squiggles here, it's trying to portray on stone an onyx marble design or something like that. That's what Hugh Ferry and Michael Alter are trying to argue here. No, they're not actually a match. Onyx marble doesn't follow. This is clearly, despite this artist of the Hungarian Pray Codex being a bad artist, he sucks. He doesn't have a lot of talent. He kind of draws like me. But generally speaking, the painting has a clear and deliberate step pattern on the Pray Codex. This is something the artist did on purpose with intelligent design in mind, specified purpose. You can clearly see a step-like design being used, not like the random wavy lines of onyx marble at all. There's purpose here, there's design here. And it's on this basis that nuclear engineer Bob Rucker conclusively demonstrated on a show with the Shroud Skeptic Hugh Ferry on it, by the way, that actually herringbone weave on the Shroud of Turin, when viewed close up, actually matches this kind of step pattern when seen with the naked human eye at close range. Textile experts like Dr. Methchild Fleur-Lemberg, in charge of the 2002 restoration project, have said, based on their expertise, this must be a depiction of herringbone weave cloth, and that would be impossible unless they knew about the Shroud of Turin. So let's see the clip of Bob and Dr. Methchild Fleur-Lemberg here.
And last time I was talking with Hugh, we had a little disagreement as to the stair-step arrangement that's shown on the on the item. Let me share what I have up now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So anyway, this slide shows where I would identify the stair-step arrangement in the 3-to-1 herringbone twill weave of the Shroud of Turin. Okay, and that's why I would say that what we see here on the Shroud of Turin, this stair step here, is a good indicator that this really is the Shroud of Turin, based upon that.
This is one of its 5 illustrations, and it shows Jesus being placed in his burial shroud. Mechtild Fleury-Lemberg is a textile expert who is charged with preserving the fabric of the shroud. She studied these images of Christ in the manuscript and identified a number of features that reappear on the Turin shroud. The most obvious is that the figure on the shroud has the arms crossed and the thumb hidden under the hand.
On the top, you see the painting with the corpse laying on a white linen, as one would expect, which is normal, a white linen. And you see the arms crossed, and you see the 4 fingers. The thumb is invisible, is hidden, and that is also a connection. It's also visible the same on the shroud.
Lemberg is also very aware of the geometric weave of the shroud.
What is more important for a textile historian, as I am, you see painted herringbone pattern. And this herringbone pattern is a typical sign of the Shroud of Turin.
Another feature of the cloth are the holes bunched together in an L shape.
These holes here, these L holes, they are on this picture and they are on the shroud 4 times because it was folded in 4 layers. You see here small holes, a little bit bigger, and then here you see the bigger ones.
Oh, I see.
The painter of this picture must have seen the Shroud of Turin. Otherwise, it's not possible because it's exactly the signs which we find also on the shroud in Turin.
All right, so as you can see, that's pretty compelling from a textile historian like Dr. Methchild Fleur-Lemberg, She, by the way, was the textile expert that in 1988, the atheist carbon-14 scientists wanted her to be the one to select the sample location to be carbon dated back in 1988. She had other obligations at that time as a world's expert textile historian, so she wasn't able to make it, unfortunately. But she was put in charge after that of the 2002 Shroud Restoration Project to restore the Shroud of Turin. So this is the caliber of scholar, and she's supporting the pro-Shroud side here. Very interesting. I think if we have Hugh Ferry's Oinks Marble interpretation versus in light of what we saw with Bob Rucker and the step pattern, and the expert testimony of Dr. Metral Fleur-Lemberg, the textile expert that even atheistic carbon-14 scientists recognize as having the number one expert in the world on textiles, and they're supporting the pro-Shroud side, I think I know who I side with. Okay, finally, Michael Alter goes over other commonalities like the crossed arm. He says, well, there's a 33% chance or probability you would get this because given you have the arms, you can either put them placed at the sides of the hips, crossed over the hands with each arm contacting the opposing shoulder area, or crossed over the genitals. So there's a 33% chance they were going to cross it over the genitals, especially if they wanted to depict Jesus nude. Then there's a 100% chance they're going to. He also says there's a 50% chance because humans have two arms, so there's a 50-50 shot that it would be right over left as opposed to left over right. Just happens to get that correct. And even if you combine these probabilities, 0.33 times 50% is, I don't know what it is, but it's 17% or something. Let's just say that 16 to 17% or something like that. Well, things with a 16% probability of occurrence happen all the time in this world. In fact, you have people win the lotteries and they have way less than a 16% probability of winning. So there's nothing complex in terms of a specified complexity argument here that's provable. What about the total nudity? So Michael Alter says, well, Jesus is naked. And if you claim that's unique, that's totally false and it's a deceptive argument. And he gives examples in this footnote number 37 of examples of a naked Jesus in medieval iconography, such as Schweitschbug Holstein's Dom altar in the 13th century, the Book of Hours in the southern Netherlands, dating to 1375 to 1400, and the Entombment of Christ, in a third example in the cloisters, dated to the 13th century or 1200s. Here's the point. All of these post-date the Hungarian Pray Codex. Up until that date and before it, you never, not once, ever see a naked Jesus being portrayed in the resurrection scene, or that the particular scenes that the Pray Codex is saying is depicting. They never disrespect Jesus that way. Now, there are very early, dating back to the 4th century, naked Jesuses, but these are usually at his baptism, and his manhood is obscured by water or something like this. So it's a little bit obscured, and it's something to do with his baptism. They would never dream of portraying Jesus naked at the moment of his triumph and victory at the resurrection, with the three Mary scenes and stuff like that, and or when he's being buried on the cross and stuff like that. They do it after this, but it seems the Hungarian Pray Codex is the first known work to ever do this. And the reason for that is because, he's copying an authoritative source, the Shroud of Turin, and he's naked on the shroud, so that gave him license to paint Jesus naked on the Pray Codex. That's the argument, and I don't think Alter's counter is really effective here by citing works not from the time, but that post-date the time, because once one person does it, it's okay to do it then, fine, I'll do it too, and stuff like that. So of course there are naked Jesuses after the Hungarian Pray Codex, but not up until that time, not in those scenes, only in things like the baptism or something like that. So that's the argument. It's a little bit more nuanced than Alter makes it seem. That's my only point on the total nudity aspect. He also says there's no scourge wounds and stuff, and I think this is a valid point. think about it. In the bottom picture of the Hungarian Pray Codex, there are a bunch of red crosses. And some people say, well, these are symbolic of the blood stains on the cloth. And even here is claimed to be the blood belt across the back of the shroud man's back. Otherwise, these red squiggly lines are just inexplicable, right? But they say these represent the blood stains. Well, if that's true, then why in the top image, why are there no scourge wounds on Jesus's naked body? If he made a point to depict the bloodstains on the cloth, why not the scourge wound bloodstains on the naked body of Jesus? And this seems to be a good skeptical counter against it, this being a copy of the Shroud of Turin, I admit. Michael Alter also says, as the long fingers and no thumbs, well, these are just common Byzantine artistic features. This is true. Even on the Hungarian Pray Codex itself, the man anointing Jesus' body only shows his 4 fingers and no thumbs, for example. They're very elongated fingers. So there's nothing unique or special about that. This is just the Byzantine artistic technique. That said, with the scourge wounds, just going back to that for a second, I just want to say, but what is the significance? Because pro-shroud experts will say, well, this was just an artistic choice. He didn't want to portray those on the body of Christ for whatever reason. And if you follow the logic of the skeptic, you go, well, the shroud must be, the shroud can't be real because the shroud couldn't be used as an impetus for the Hungarian Pray Codex because of the lack of scourge wounds. If he had seen the shroud, he would have known there were scourge wounds on the body. In the first place, remember, a lot of them are invisible and only seen under ultraviolet fluorescence in terms of the details. But secondly, even the ones that are seen, look, the artist of the Hungarian Pray Codex, he knew the Gospels, right? And the Gospels say he had scourge wounds all over his body, his naked body, and bloodstains. So basically, if you follow this logic, the skeptic will have to say, well, the Hungarian Pray Codex didn't even know the gospel data, the basic gospels saying Jesus was scourged and whipped and stuff, because he doesn't depict it here. No, clearly he knew the gospels. He knew the gospel story about Jesus being whipped and scourged. He just didn't want to portray that with blood for whatever reason. This is his artistic license. That makes more sense than saying, and in that case, that same logic can apply to the shroud. He knew the shroud had bloodstains, but it's an artistic license. He didn't want to portray them for whatever reason. That would be the defeater or the counter here. Now, like I said, if the red crosses are meant to be bloodstains, I do think the skeptics have more of a point here. Well, why would he depict them on the cloth but not on the body? So you'd have to abandon, what the red crosses don't represent bloodstains. If they actually represent red crosses, well, how is that related to the shroud? So there is an issue here that needs to be worked out in favor of the skeptics. Alter then goes on to list 17 differences, some of which I think are trivial, others are more important. So, for example, the Turin shroud has blood on the head, and the Pray manuscript does not. Well, actually, that's wrong. Some people have said the epsilon wound on the forehead is shown. So let's take a look. The epsilon wound is depicted from the crown of thorns. There's also that blood belt that I mentioned. He also says the Turin shroud has facial abrasions and bruises, but the Pray manuscript does not. The Turin shroud has telltale signs of swollen face, but the PM does not. The Turin shroud has Jesus with a full beard, but the PM does not. Again, artistic license. You wouldn't expect him to depict. He's not a modern forensic artist who's depicting every little thing. And this guy just is a bad artist. So I don't think any of these necessarily falsify it. I think the beard issue is a little more important than the others, but it's still not conclusive in any way. 5, the Turin shroud has approximately 120 scourge whip marks. We covered this. Don't forget there is the blood belt that is depicted supposedly as well with those red squiggly lines. 6, 7, and 8. The PM has 2 disciples holding the shroud, but the TS does not. The Turin shroud does not. My answer to this was like, what? How do you expect the shroud to depict 2 men outside the borders of the shroud cloth itself? The shroud is the shroud. It's depicting what is within its borders. That was the body of Jesus Christ at the moment of resurrection. there weren't two people actually holding the shroud at the moment of Jesus's resurrection. So we wouldn't expect it. Even if there was two men holding the shroud at the precise moment of Jesus' resurrection in the tomb, just for the sake of argument, they wouldn't be depicted on the shroud because they're not within the borders of the shroud. They are outside of it. So unless you expect the cloth to have holographic projectors or something to project images outside of itself, I'm shocked that you point to this as a difference. This seems incomprehensible to me. I'll just be honest. This is horrible reasoning. It's nonsense. He also says the Pray manuscript has Jesus anointed at the burial, but the Turin shroud does not. So yes, okay. So again, artistic license and basically just false information on the part of the artistic drawing. So he's portraying something that's not gospel accurate nor Turin shroud accurate. Also, in terms of Jesus being anointed at the burial, there's an argument there from scholars saying that he was, and the spices were there and present and stuff like that, perhaps in dry form, and that actually the burial spices were more about the smell rather than anointing the body. Mark Neer, famous scholar, and other biblical scholars have confirmed this, that there's no problem here. Also, the Pray manuscript has Jesus lying dead, half of a shroud, on half of the shroud, but the Turin shroud does not. Jesus lies flat. Again, this is just kind of nitpicking, in my opinion. Like, yeah, he depicts the shroud in an inaccurate way in the top image. He's just showing that it's folded up and he's lying flat in front of it, but it has no basis in what actually happened with the Turin shroud. This is just an artistic depiction of the gospel presentation. So not everything depicted had to be copied from the shroud, or we would expect it to be a part of the shroud. Again, the shroud man depicts the moment of resurrection. It doesn't depict Jesus being carried to the cross, from the cross to the tomb, or the burial, or anything like that. It depicts direct moment of resurrection only. The Pray manuscript has creases on Jesus's butt. Okay, again, artistic license. This is nitpicking, I think. The Pray manuscript has a cross on the bottom of the image, but the Turin shroud does not. I tried to find, I'm not sure what he's talking about here, but bottom of the image. So if he's talking about the Pray manuscript image itself outside of the cloth, yeah, who cares? We wouldn't expect. There are details outside of what's privy to the cloth that are being depicted in the painting. We have no expectation for that all to be depicted on the Shroud of Turin. The shroud contained Jesus's body at the moment of resurrection. So, like, again, this is making the same nonsensical point, in my humble opinion. The PM has a halo under Jesus' head. In Christian iconography, the Christ Pantocrator, but the Turin shroud does not. Again, artistic license. The Turin shroud has a wound on the side, but the PM does not. This is a fair point, again, along the lines of the scourge wounds. Again, the answer is artistic license. However, I think it could be more established. There may be an expectation for this to be portrayed, but it's still plausible to deny this expectation, because think about it. Again, the artist who painted this picture knew the gospel data. He knew the Gospel of John said Jesus had a side wound, and yet he still doesn't portray it. But this doesn't mean the artist was denying the Gospels, or had never read the Gospel of John, or had heard the story from the Gospel of John about the wound on the side of Jesus. He just chose not to draw it. So if you're going to deny that the shroud was used because, if he saw the shroud, he should know there's a blood stain in the chest, or the chest wound, then you have to, by the same logic, you have to say, well, I guess the artist never encountered the Gospel of John itself then. That would be highly improbable to be true. So that's the counters. But again, there is something here on the side of the skeptics. This is not just a nonsensical point or a triviality or a nitpick. Why isn't it there? Especially if the bottom panel is portraying those red crosses as bloodstains, and he portrays the blood belt. but he doesn't give Jesus a wound on the side, that requires some kind of explanation why. I would expect, right? Was there some historical reason why artists didn't want to portray wounds on Jesus himself? 13, the Turin shroud has the right palm over the base of the left hand, but the Pray manuscript does not. So this is the precise location. Again, many reasons for this, right? Again, it's not like the artist of the Pray Codex is sitting there looking at the shroud in precise detail and copying it out. He's doing it based on memory when he's not looking at it. He got a glimpse of the shroud, and then he went away back to Hungary or whatever, and he made the manuscript based on memory of what stood out to him, what he remembered of it. We wouldn't expect precision details. This is a nitpick. The Turin shroud has nail wounds on the feet, but the PM does not. Again, artistic license. Who knows? This one, there may be something to it. The PM omits a direct representation of the shroud with an imprint of Christ, as one would expect him. Now, this one is very important, and I think this is true enough. And it was one of the reasons I myself counted as negative evidence against the shroud being the impetus, and its images being the impetus for this. Perhaps there's a couple of reasons. Again, there's artistic license, or they took the time, or somebody saying that the shroud images didn't appear right away, but that seems more like a modern scientific contrivance of pro-shroud proponents. I don't think someone in the 1100s or 12th century would be thinking that way. So on this front, I do think he's got us. This is an important shroud supporting evidence for the shroud skeptics. 16, the Pray manuscript has a shroud ending at the shoulders. Again, artistic license. He's not trying to be accurate with the shroud's dimensions or anything like that in the top image. He has the folds and stuff like that, but artistic license explains this. He has the fold in the top image of the shroud. Finally, the PM has an angel walking on the shroud. So this is a nonsensical point again. Who cares? The shroud images, Turin shroud images depict anything wrapped in it at the moment of the resurrection. An angel was not walking on inside the shroud at the moment of the resurrection in a way that it would be expected to be depicted on it. Again, even in the Hungarian Pray Codex, the angel isn't depicted as on the shroud, as though it's an image on the cloth itself. He's standing on top of the cloth. So, like, what are you expecting here? This is just nonsense, in my opinion. So, what we have here, in terms of the Hungarian Pray Codex, this is the end of part 1. I think that this is the best section that Michael Alter gives. It's the most balanced, the most neutral. In terms of some of the differences, he was a bit nitpicky in some parts, and a bit even nonsensical in other parts. But for the most part, I think he did raise at least a few, 3 to 4 valid differences whereby you can establish there would be an expectation. One thing that he missed here is Hugh Ferry's prior probability argument, which is very strong. There are similar scenes to this Three Marys scene elsewhere in Byzantine art from the period, and they always are depicting this lid on this slanted sideways thing. And this was part of the reason why I changed my mind from being pro side on the Hungarian Pray Codex to now I lean on the skeptical side myself. So I agree with Michael Alter's conclusion overall, all things considered. That said, I don't think he provides a convincing reason against the L-shaped holes or the herringbone weave. I think these are still very strong pro-shroud arguments. And same with the total nakedness. I still think this is not as strong, but it still definitely works on a balance of probabilities as evidence supporting that the Hungarian Pray Codex was based on an artist's recollection of seeing the Shroud of Turin images. Overall, though, in terms of all things, all the positive, all the negative things combined, evidences combined, and considerations combined, I'm slightly leaning towards the skeptical end. I would say it's probably not based on the Shroud of Turin. I would agree with Michael Alter on this front. That said, I haven't done the calculations since my last time I did a panel review summary. So maybe at some point I will do the revived calculations with the change and add the numbers and actually calculate it out to see where exactly do I fit. Right now, I'm just sort of estimating or guesstimating in my head as to overall where I think I would land. And I do think, I would say it's a very weak case, but probably I'm a Shroud skeptic on the Hungarian Pray Codex. I don't think we can prove the Shroud was, images were probably used for the depiction of this manuscript. And in terms of reviewing Michael Alter, I do think he presented a very fair and balanced portion of this and went into detail on the strongest pro side, and even gave something new that I hadn't heard of with this Colin Berry argument from the probabilities and that sort of thing. That was something interesting that I'd never heard of or considered before. So I thank Michael Alter for educating me of Colin Berry's argument on that front, his defeater for the L-shaped holes argument. This is probably the best defeater I've seen from any Shroud skeptic on this front. But again, like I said, it still has deficiencies because it has to assume the artist was just randomly putting these things on. Why would they do that? That doesn't make sense, especially when it serves no functional or decorative purpose. And secondly, why would it just so happen to also randomly be in the similar spot as the L-shaped holes on the Shroud of Turin cloth itself? The location of the L-shaped dots also correspond to the Shroud, and that's not explained through Colin Berry's playing the odds counter here. All right, so that's it for part one. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and Michael Alter, I hope you think I gave a fair thing. Obviously, I disagree with you on a lot of your conclusions. On this front, I am pro-Shroud. I don't think the carbon dating works. I think that's a failure, even on the basis of the assessment you gave. Also, same with the D'Arcis memorandum. But I agree with you on the Hungarian Pray Codex. I think you're probably correct that this artistic representation was not based on the Shroud of Turin. Or at the very least, it's not provably based on the Shroud of Turin on a balance of probabilities. And since this is a pro-Shroud claim, it's the pro-Shroud side that has the burden of proof on this front. So, yeah, I hope you think this was fair, Michael, and I look forward. Like I said, we've got a total of 13 points. I've covered the first 3 where Alter goes into the most detail, but I want to start looking at the other factors starting in part 2. Maybe it'll go into part 3. But starting in part 2, we're going to be looking at the evidence from ancient fabrics or textile evidence. So that's what we'll be looking at next time in terms of Michael Alter's Shroud chapter. All right. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.